gratitude and delight that that you're all here in this virtual world. And as I mentioned, Jana has a very important meeting, and we deeply appreciate that she was able to take this moment out before she goes to the funeral to speak with us. So Jana, I'm assuming that you all know Jana, who is who was the president of the Anglican Lutheran Society in England, and was the chaplain in Riga in St. Saviour's Anglican Church, and is now active with many other things. And so, Jana, we give the opening moment to you with our gratitude.
Thank you, it's really kind. Just to say that the Anglican Lutheran Society is a worldwide phenomenon, not just an English phenomenon. In fact, I saw that Tom Van Poel, one of our members in the US, is present in this online meeting. But so, good morning and welcome in a distance, but nonetheless a very warm way, to this seminar marking the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Portable Declaration. And I'm sorry that I have to leave immediately after this, but I have a funeral to run in these strange lockdown conditions, and so I will have to leave immediately. But as I was thinking about what to say today, I wondered what the symbolism for us is today in the fact that we are meeting virtually and with the mediation of various forms of technology, so we are brought together. And yet we are separated by a variety of screens and networks and so on. Given that the stated aim of the Portable Communion is to bring about a common mission and to call churches together to proclaim God's love and presence, is it a blessing that we can join together at all? Or is it a source of profound regret that we cannot all sit together in the library of the University of Latvia? To quote from the common statement agreed in 1992, in the face of all the questions arising from our common mission today, our churches are called together to proclaim a duty of service to the wider world and to the societies in which they are set. Equally, they are called together to proclaim the Christian hope arising from faith, which gives meaning in societies characterized by ambiguity. Again, they are called together to proclaim the healing love of God and reconciliation in communities wounded by persecution, oppression, and injustice. This common proclamation in word and sacrament manifests the mystery of God's love, God's presence, and God's kingdom, words which could just as well have been written this year. And those of us who are involved in ecumenical dialogue and activities will recognize these words as being akin to so many hopeful reflections that can be found in our joint documents. There's no arguing against these high aims. Of course, we wish to proclaim a duty of service to the world. Of course, we are called to proclaim the great Christian hope, the healing love of God, and so on. And for those who believe in ecumenism, we are called to do this together, whenever and wherever we can. That's the very basic foundation of ecumenical endeavor, reflected in the often repeated dictum, we should do together what we can do together. In reality, of course, we do equally often fall short of all the high ideals expressed in officially signed and approved agreements. Individual desires and ambitions intervene. The urge to promote our own interests at the expense of others. Old suspicions of other churches, and indeed, a few new suspicions that have developed. All of those hinder us in our journey towards a common proclamation. However, despite all the negative thoughts and reflections that we might mention about the implementation and realization of the Portable Agreement, and there have been weaknesses and failures, there's no doubting that, The Porvoo Communion of Churches also carries within it huge and as yet partially untapped potential for the development of ecumenical ministries, worship, and theologies. Just imagine the positive influence that churches working together in close cooperation, in mutual respect, love, and harmony could have on the major issues of today: the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, and the epidemic rise of intolerance and various forms of hateful discrimination. If we were truly to join minds and hearts to proclaim the healing love of God and reconciliation in communities wounded by persecution, oppression, and injustice, to model, in other words, cooperation and respect across denominational, historical, geographical, and psychological boundaries, that would truly be the most wonderful witness for healing to a world that seems increasingly fractured and feverish. The great advantage that churches have is that we hold a longer-term view of the world than politicians are able to manage, since our perspective is a kingdom view, a view bounded by eternity rather than the need to win votes at the next election. In their introduction to the Porvoo Agreement, which was written in 1993, Bishops David Tustin and Tore Furberg wrote, "Only in the course of time will the full consequences of the declaration be able to be gauged. If the gospel is to be allowed to define and shape the life of our communities, this requires us not only to be faithful to the tradition which we have inherited, but also to be responsive to new issues." Wise words, of course, and perhaps 25 years against the background of eternity is far too short a time to gauge the way in which the Porvoo Communion will develop. After all, as I'm sure Jaakko will be able to affirm, even the city of Porvoo itself is celebrating 675 years this year. But the tension between faithfulness to the gospel and to our church traditions on the one hand, and a flexibility in responding to challenges both ecclesiastical and communal, is one of the most important features of Porvoo and its outworkings. The modern ecumenical movement was born out of several convergent impulses: the two world wars, the desire in the 1940s for the world never to experience such horror again, the founding of global organizations such as the United Nations, and so on. Today, when we face once again such very major challenges to the very survival of humanity, may this era in which new and unforeseen issues have arisen, may that lead us to new energy in the whole ecumenical field, and within the Porvoo community in particular. Let me just end quickly with a quote from Unitatis Redintegratio, in recognition of the fact that the Second Vatican Council also gave us many insights and impulses in the ecumenical process, which were crucially important beyond Roman Catholic dialogues with other churches. And I quote, "Cooperation among Christians vividly expresses the relationship which in fact already unites them, and it sets in clearer relief the features of Christ the servant. This cooperation, which has already begun in many countries, should be developed more and more, particularly in regions where a social and technical evolution is taking place, be it in a just evaluation of the dignity of the human person, the establishment of the blessings of peace, the application of gospel principles to social life, the advancement of the arts and sciences in a truly Christian spirit, or also in the use of various remedies to relieve the afflictions of our times, such as famine and natural disasters, illiteracy and poverty, housing shortage, and the unequal distribution of wealth. All believers in Christ can, through this cooperation, be led to acquire a better knowledge and appreciation of one another, and so pave the way to Christian unity. So may this day be a blessing to everyone who takes part, and I wish you all the very best for this and for the future development of Porvoo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jana, and appreciate both the scope of your introductory remarks and especially that you point out that there's still great scope for the development of the Porvoo Agreement, ecumenism and cooperation. And as you wish us a successful morning and day, so we also send our greetings to you and your difficult and at the same time very responsible task this morning in the Doma Cathedral. We'll let you go, and let me just then move into our agenda for the day to explain that the arrangement is, as I suppose we all know, that we invite the speakers to speak for approximately 20 minutes, leaving about 10 minutes of discussion among all the participants of this gathering, of this conference. And so that we don't waste any more time, let me then invite with great pleasure and delight from Helsinki, Jaakko Ruusama, the adjunct professor, and also the national coordinator of the Anglican Lutheran Society in Finland, also, of course, a pastor in the Church of Finland, who will speak about the wider question that has gathered us all together, Porvoo process as part of the Church's common witness. Jaakko, thank you very much, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joris. Thank you so much, and good morning to everyone. I do hope that you will be able to see my slides. Can you see them now?
We see them.
Very good. Okay, in that case, I will start with that. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Bishop Jana, for your very wise and encouraging words about the Porvoo process. Now, the Porvoo process has been well described and documented 5 years ago in a superb collection of articles called Towards Closer Unity, Communion of the Porvoo Church's 20 Years. It's here on this picture, here below, Towards Closer Unity. Many general descriptions of the Porvoo process have been published, and also some doctoral dissertations on specific issues. And here we have some examples of them. Therefore, I have chosen to look at our theme from a slightly different angle. My view is that the Porvoo process between some Anglican and some Lutheran churches has a long history. When we now celebrate the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Porvoo Declaration, we may look at what has happened many decades earlier between the churches and church communions. As this conference is held in Latvia, at least in theory, I like to highlight some aspects of the Anglican Lutheran talks before the First and the Second World War between the Church of England, the Church of Sweden, and the Evangelical Lutheran churches of Finland, Estonia, and Latvia. I have previously studied extensively these contacts, but today I will leave detailed descriptions to Riho and Valdis, who will speak from the Estonian and Latvian perspectives. It is interesting that there have been only a few difficulties in these dialogues and conversations. As Mark Chapman will later discuss, historic episcopate has been central for the Anglicans. The understanding and interpretation of episcopacy has had and still has different interpretations among the Lutheran churches. Also, the Porvoo process, as part of a wider ecumenical movement, includes different forms of Anglicanism and Lutheranism. Due to historical, cultural, and other reasons, churches approach and express differently their confessional traditions, if they happen to have clearly defined confessional traditions. Today, the fastest global growth of Christians is among the charismatic movement and Pentecostal churches. our very northern hemisphere approach to churches is mostly based on the concept of denominations and confessions. It is not necessarily the only way towards Christian unity. In the ecumenical movement, we are increasingly challenged. We have seen the changing role of the international ecumenical confessional bodies, in particular the changing role of the World Council of Churches during the past 30 years. Today, less than 25% of Christians in the world belong to churches which are member churches of the World Council of Churches. A flexible network in the form of Global Christian Forum represents a quite different and, in a sense, wider ecumenical context in global Christianity. This is to say that ecumenically, the Church's common witness happens very differently on many diverse levels. Church history shows how important it has always been what happens at the local level between ordinary people, and very often regardless of what the churches have formally agreed upon. I think we need to remember that Anglicanism does not only mean the Church of England, and Lutheranism does not only mean German or Nordic or Baltic Lutheranism. Globally, regionally, and nationally, the Anglican or Episcopal churches differ very much not only in their practices, but also in their theological interpretations. There is also a wide variety of Lutheran churches which participate in ecumenical activities. As we well know, there are worldwide major divisions among the Anglican and Lutheran churches. We could even say that we are neither one in the Anglican communion or among the Anglican tradition, nor in the Lutheran world Christianity. Whatever we say of our common prayers for Christian unity, it is vitally important that we have a clear understanding of what the Church is for. It is not only a denominational challenge, but it is also a crucial identity challenge for every church. Openness to dialogues is vital for the churches and for the common witness of the Christian Church in the world today. There are more than 50 international, regional, and national dialogues and conversations going on now. In recent years, the Anglicans have had dialogues with for instance, the Seventh-day Adventists, Baptists, Methodists, Moravians, Lutherans, Old Catholics, Oriental Orthodox, Reformed, and Roman Catholics. Either nationally, regionally, or through the Lutheran World Federation, the Lutheran churches, for their part, have been engaged in dialogues, for instance, with the Anglicans, Baptists, Mennonites, Methodists, Orthodox, Pentecostals, Reformed, and the Roman Catholic Church. The Anglican Communion and the Anglican churches in many Anglican provinces have for decades been not only active in their contacts, but also in many cases the driving forces in the modern ecumenical movement. Having said all this, I think I try to concentrate on these 6 points in this short presentation. Something about the present situation and the diversity, then a few words of the Church of England, the Finnish Lutheran Church talks, and then Estonian, Latvian Lutheran Churches conversations, and then something about this whole process, and finally, what I feel are very important objectives for our conversations. First, conversations with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland, which took place in 1933 and 34. They were the result of the arrangements between the churches of England and Sweden earlier in the 20th century. The key figure and driving force was the Archbishop of Uppsala, Sweden, Dr. Nathan Söderblom. Though he died in 1931, it was his initiative which led to the conversations in Finland and in Estonia and Latvia. The results of the Church of England, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland conversations were published in the Joint Report 1934, and the issues as described here were the Holy Scriptures, the creeds, the sacraments, the ministry, and missionary questions. The last one dealt with especially what happened in what is now called area, what the area is now called Namibia. The report contained 3 recommendations, and they were in invitation to take part, whatever that means, in the consecrations of bishops. Secondly, the admission of communicants to the Holy Communion, and thirdly, invitation to the Lutheran bishops to attend the Lambeth conferences and to the Anglican bishops to similar conferences in the Finnish Lutheran Church. The report was approved in the Church of England and the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland in 1936. The real presence of Christ in the Eucharist was discussed. Was the Lutheran Eucharist a real Eucharist in the Anglican understanding? In the light of the results of the talks, it was not the case. Instead of intercommunion, we ought to speak about Eucharistic hospitality. Then briefly about the conversations with the Estonian and Latvian Lutheran churches, which took place in 1936 and 1938. They were slightly different. General superintendents had been between 1710 and 1921 governed the Estonian and Latvian Lutheran churches ecclesiastically. In 1921, Archbishop Nathan Söderblom, assisted by the Finnish Bishop Jaakko Gumerus, consecrated Rev. Jan Kuk as Bishop of Tallinn. The following year, Archbishop Söderblom, assisted by the Bishop of Estonia, Jan Kuk, consecrated the first Latvian Lutheran Bishop Karl Irbe. In the 1920s, the Estonian and Latvian Lutheran churches were actively represented in the International Committee of the World Alliance for Promoting Christian Unity. Bishop Irbe also attended the 1927 World Conference of Faith and Order in Lausanne. Also, in 1927, the first Baltic Theological Conference was held in Helsinki, where the main topic was cooperation between the theological faculties in respective countries. And in addition, representatives of the Estonian and Latvian Lutheran churches took part in the Anglo-Scandinavian theological conferences on several occasions during the 1930s. As a sign of growing ecumenical cooperation between international ecumenical bodies and churches from the neighboring countries, an ecumenical regional conference for the Baltic Sea states was held in Tallinn in 1935. There were Lutheran and Orthodox churchmen from Estonia, Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, and Sweden. One of the themes which was discussed was the meaning of the economic and political problem of Bolshevism to Europe. It is obvious that to the international ecumenical community, the threat from Bolshevist and atheistic Soviet Union was a real one. Contacts to the West and to ecumenical organizations were eagerly sought by the Baltic Lutheran churches. Now, in 1935, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, asked the Bishop of Gloucester, Arthur Headlam, who had chaired the conversation with the Finnish Lutheran Church, to lead the Church of England delegation in the conversation with the Estonian and Latvian Lutheran churches. And the first conversations took place at Lambeth Palace in London in 1936. Headlam wrote, "With the Church of Sweden, we have intercommunion, and it is hoped that we may be extended to these other Episcopal churches in the Baltic." The report of the conversation dealt with the Holy Scriptures, the creeds, the sacraments, and the ministry. And here I have a quotation what Bishop Headlam said. "On doctrinal questions, I do not think there is any real serious difference between the churches, nor in fact indeed on sacramental questions. I think the tendency of both churches is on the whole towards a common Catholic position than other Lutheran bodies. But the difficulty, of course, lies in the question of church order and the ministry." I will not go into detail on what he meant here. The second round of these conversations took place in Riga, Latvia, and in Tallinn in 1938. During his stay in Latvia and Estonia, Anglican Bishop Headlam also preached in the Lutheran services. The joint report 1938 was remarkably like what had been achieved with the Finnish Lutheran Church a few years earlier. Instead of 3 recommendations, the Estonian-Latvian report included a 4th recommendation which reads that the Anglican clergy should be ready to baptize and marry members of the Latvian and Estonian Evangelical Lutheran churches in England or in any British colony, and that the clergy of Latvia and Estonia should perform like functions for members of the Anglican Church who have not access to an Anglican clergyman. It is to be desired also that they provide certification of baptism and marriage. This was not included in the Finnish Church of England talks. In the Church of England, the question of the Estonian and Latvian Lutheran churches were dealt with in the two convocations of Canterbury and York in 1939. I will not go into those discussions, which in themselves were very interesting. During the Second World War, the fate of the Baltic nations and churches was very much discussed in the Church of England. The Church expressed her or its wish to give spiritual and material support for those suffering from the invasions. The Bishop of Gloucester, A.C. Headlam, wrote in the Manchester Guardian in January 1944 of the Baltic deportees, "I have considerable knowledge of the people both of Latvia and Estonia. They have suffered much during the war, and I hope everything may be done to restore their people and their liberty." And after the war, the Lambeth Conference of 1948 passed a resolution saying it reports its sympathy and offers its prayers for these churches, many of whose clergy and laity are now scattered abroad, having no home or possessions of their own and having suffered previous hardships. It recommends that Anglicans should give all material and spiritual help possible to these unhappy exiles and looks forward to the day when it will be possible, after full agreement in faith and order, to advance further the relation with the Anglican Communion and these churches in conditions of mutual confidence and understanding.
Jaakko, if you would like to finish in about 5 minutes.
I will do that. I will do that. Thank you. So much for the history. Where are we now? The Porvoo process has been part of the ongoing stream of church contacts worldwide. Many things have changed since the Porvoo conversation started late 1980s. Also, the churches and the societies where the churches operate have dramatically changed. The whole scene of Christianity and theological emphases have changed and are constantly transforming. This is a positive challenge, not only for church relations, but especially for the church's common witness. Now, as you can see, what I've written here, one of the challenges in the ecumenical dialogues still is your friend also my friend? A good example are the links between the Church of England with the Old Catholic Church, and some Lutheran churches have slightly similar agreements and relationships. In addition, we are now working towards tripartite talks, namely Anglican Lutheran Roman Catholic and Anglican Lutheran Methodist talks. But we have to remember that the major breakthrough naturally was the Declaration of the Doctrine of Justification, which today unites not only Roman Catholics and Lutherans who created the document, but also Anglicans, Methodists, and the Reformed. So this is the scene today. We have a number of Anglican Lutheran dialogues and conversations going on, starting from the Porvoo Common Statement and even before that, as I already described. So we live in a very active period of time where the churches formally talk to each other. Of all these talks, I would say that one of the most promising one is what is happening in Canada. It's called Churches Beyond Borders. They have full communion between the Episcopal Anglican Church in Canada and the Lutheran Church, and also the Episcopal Church in the United States and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in the US. The Anglican Primate, Linda Nichols, says, "I think both our agreement and the one in the States are kind of forerunners. We are the ones that are testing it out and testing it out because we need to. We need to be pointing to that unity as churches. It does not require us to be identical, but can show us working together and having a stronger voice because we do work together." And finally, I would like to quote from a recent Finnish document, which deals with unity in diversity and visible unity. Here are the 4 objectives of doctrinal conversations. And I think they very well summarize where we stand now and what will be our future. Becoming acquainted with each other and building collaboration. Secondly, attainment of Eucharistic communion. Thirdly, practical implementation of an ecumenical agreement, shared operating models, distribution of resources. And fourthly, common decision-making structures. Very briefly, Juris, this is what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jaakko. A wonderful beginning. Also, by the way, you didn't even take your 20 minutes, so...
I was warned.
I apologize for breaking in and giving you that warning. You didn't need it. But the wonderful thing about your introduction is that you've again reminded us of what this is all about, but especially place it in a much larger context. And I think that's that in fact was the hope, and you fulfilled it marvelously. So thank you very much. We have these minutes now, about 8 minutes before the next presentation for discussion, and so I open the floor to all of us who would like to ask Jaakko and join in this discussion. Perhaps Jaakko, you could remove the
yes.
Your
let me see this.
Then we can see each other. Yes, thanks very much. So the floor is open for questions and comments. Who would like to?
I would like to ask. I would like to ask. Oh, sorry, my dog. I would like to ask this. You told that my friend is your friend also. That in this church dialogue we're watching, we're looking at who is your friend and my friend, and I would like to ask you maybe your opinion on how churches can concentrate more on this friendship. Maybe if it's needed to find my friend, your friend. Okay, but to redirect this this focus of not friendship, but which is who is your enemy? An enemy I'm putting in quotes, like who is more different like you? How churches can maybe be more about this dialogue together and not focusing on what is our differences, bigger or smaller, and is it even possible?
Thank you. Very good question. I think one of the starting points, the way we talk, whenever we talk about ecumenical contacts and collaboration and relationships between the churches, is that we will struggle to understand what is our own identity, and then we really have to be open to common search to express visible unity. The strongest weapon or instrument in the Christian church is prayer. What we need to do is to start praying together. And it means that we do not base our relationships and contacts on doctrinal documents or agreements. We will base the visible unity of Christians in the common witness and common faith. And that is expressed in hundreds of different ways, which, to put it very simply, means that what is important is that ordinary Christians belonging to different churches or different church traditions, they will pray together, they will meet face to face, they will respect each other, they will listen to each other, and they will feel common bond between themselves. So we are talking about human communities which have various instruments to help to overcome differences. So I would say that the whole ecumenical movement is a movement of individual people, sinful people who try to come to terms with themselves and with other people. This is very challenging, but it is also a very positive challenge, I would say.
Thank you. Pastor Georgian, I think you were first, and I apologize for not recognizing your hand.
No worries, thank you. I'm not turning on the camera because my cat is being naughty. Thank you, Professor Rusama, for this very interesting overview and shaping the framework. My question was about the, you talked about the attraction of charismatic and Pentecostal traditions. We know that attraction is waning, or at least it's slowing down, and in some places it's even regressing. We know that young people are leaving conservative churches. They think that there are too many ties, especially in America, too many ties with politics that they want to see broken, even though that they are not joining any denominational churches. What is the role, you think, there of ecumenism as we, Anglicans, Lutherans, perhaps practice it, and the welcoming of the knowns, the people that are non-denominational, non-institutional, but still spiritual, or the younger generation that may have a charismatic Pentecostal in-breast character, but they don't want all the politics and the conservatism and the nastiness with it.
Well, thank you very, very much for the question. We could have a 2 hours discussion on this, but there are a couple of interesting statistics in the world. The number of individual Christians is growing rapidly in the world. This is a fact. And the most rapid growth is in Africa and Asia. So when we are now in Europe, we tend to look at the denominationally, otherwise the European Sea. Now, you're quite right in saying that our understanding of denominations or confessions is challenged, because the most growing trend in global Christianity is based on biblical teaching without any confessional documents. I have several personal experiences teaching at the university when we visited the ethnic congregations, and they had no knowledge or even interest in denominations or doctrinal documents. The only thing they needed is the Bible and the preaching tradition. That's it, full stop. And this is the fastest growing trend at the moment globally. And I would say that they will really put a challenge for the traditional or mainline churches. Now, but your question about what will happen to the young people who are disillusioned or do not understand what the mainline church is we live in a postmodern era, which means that people are not interested, many people are not interested in the truth, which we are proclaiming in the church. But even worse, the people are not even interested in the questions. They do not want to hear the answers, but they do not need to have any questions. So this is a common challenge for all the churches, how to reach out to people with the message which has always had difficulties to be implemented during different centuries and to different generations.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Rusama. And again, with profound gratitude for this wider scope that sets a wonderful context for all the rest of the presentations today. We now go to the second lecture this morning from Riho Altorn, who's a professor in Tartu University. But I'm not sure, Riho, I always think that you're really a professor of the University of Latvia, Faculty of Theology. But as always, you're our beloved brother here in Riga. And so I invite you to present your lecture on the POVO agreement in the context and reception in Estonia. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm indeed also still the visiting professor at the University of Latvia. But I was thinking that if in the program I was as a foreign guest, so it's better to be a foreign guest today.
Does it pay more to be a foreign guest, or?
I'm afraid so, as usually. But in any case, I have only 20 minutes, and I will also make some hints to Latvia, but my presentation is about one church, how it acts inside POVO agreement, and what are the views inside this church. As we heard earlier, just from Jaakko Ruusamaa, there are contacts between the churches, but what happens inside one church in the framework of all those agreements. And my hypothesis or my claim is that the churches are also not unanimous in acting inside those agreements, and there are many different opinions. And I will bring this out. Hopefully I can show it as a slideshow. So, and I try to keep my 20 minutes, so I will run through the history, because I will have also an introduction of little empirical research I made specifically for this presentation. So, historical context, we always speak about Bishop Hugo Bernhard Rahamägi in Estonia when we speak about the contacts between Estonian and Anglican Church. And indeed, Hugo Bernhard Rahamägi was the leading figure here, and he was also the Dean of the Faculty of Theology in Tartu and professor of this faculty. And he followed the example, in fact, of the church of the Finnish church. But one can say also that Latvian church was here ahead of Estonian church, as Bishop Rahamägi started a correspondence after he heard in 1936 that the Latvians were invited to take part in negotiations with the Anglicans. So there were two English Baltic conferences in 1936 and 38, and the Anglicans wanted the Baltic churches to accept the principle that bishops should be ordained in historical succession, and it was easily accepted by Estonian church because Rahamägi was ordained by the Archbishop of Uppsala, but not by Latvian side. And probably Valdis will tell about Latvian issues later, more about it. So the agreement in 1938, and the main subjects were ordination and priesthood, particularly the episcopal office. And in 1939, also the Dean of Chichester, Duncan Jones, visited Estonia, but further communication was blocked by the Second World War. And in 1940, the Estonian Lutheran Church invited the Anglicans to participate in the consecration of the new bishop, Johann Kõpp, but nothing came of it because of the war. One should say that the then Estonian Lutheran Church had doubts about this agreement because it seems that the main fears concerned the Catholicism of the Church of England and possible weakening of ties to German Lutheranism. So when we jump into the recent history, we will see that the signing of the Porvoo Agreement was a logical consequence of the regional and global dialogue between the Lutherans and the Anglicans that reached the Baltic churches during the times of political changes and newly opened religious freedom. I mentioned here people who were involved, those who invited and those who were part of the working group. Also, there was one meeting in Tallinn and the text was finished and approved, as you know, in Järvenpää, Finland. And one of the participants, Thomas Paul, has also told in his memories that Järvenpää was simply too difficult for English delegation to pronounce, and that's why we call it Porvoo Agreement. So let's see if it's true. I hope it is. And this is the picture of people who discussed the agreement. You can see Tiit Padam here on the upper row, fourth from the left, and Thomas Paul, the second from the right, standing behind. So, and signing, one should say that the Estonian Lutheran Church became the first church after ratification by the General Synod on 19th April 1994 to approve the founding document of the new communion. And also Tallinn was one of the places where the agreement was signed, and Archbishop Jaan Kiviit is signing this. You can see him on the left, and on the right there is a Bishop of Lithuanian Church, Jonas Kalvanas Jr. So that's the historical photo here also, and some photos from this signing ceremony, procession, and reading of the document. And there are Alar Laats reading this text, and Thomas Paul and Tiit Padam standing on the right. So those persons are important, as I will tell later a bit. They were also asked in my little empirical research about their impressions. So a little intrigue in Estonia was that Estonian Lutheran Church was firstly the only church that had signed both the Loyenberg Concord, which is now called the Communion of Protestant Churches in Europe, and the Porvoo Agreement. And there was a story that Archbishop Alfred Tooming signed it without any approval earlier from the church, and simply as the act of kindness that Estonian Lutheran Church was the 50th signatory of the Loyenberg Concord, and so it came to force. And later, of course, there have been discussions saying that Loyenberg and Porvoo are kind of agreements which are not in accord to each other, not exactly, and Loyenberg is more expressing this low church attitude, and Porvoo perhaps high church. But now, of course, churches of Denmark, Iceland, and Norway are also members in both. So Estonian Church is not the only one. And the main result, or the visible result, was of course the cooperation with Anglican Church, which derives from this Porvoo Agreement for Estonian Church. And we have one congregation in Tallinn, Holy Spirit congregation, where there are also small Anglican congregation. There is a small Anglican congregation inside this congregation now, and so We don't have officially Anglican Church, but it's a connection that has been made this way. And since 2016, there is an official cooperation with the Rochester Diocese, and Bishop James Langstaff also got the Order of Merit of the Lutheran Church 2020. So you can see the signing of this agreement. So what's the problem in discussions about Porvoo communion nowadays? Of course, is that probably the church doesn't behave always as a member of Porvoo communion, and the laying on of hands has been one of the questions, how our Archbishop participates in consecration of bishops of other countries, not always, and how do we organize the consecration of our Archbishop. It has been also one of the issues where we can see that the Porvoo communion doesn't act thoroughly. So, and attitudes towards homosexuality, we are just in the middle of one scandal inside our church when one of our bishops participated in the consecration of a priest who was famous to be a leader of gay Christians in our church, and the bishop was accused now that he has participated in laying on of hands to this priest in the Lutheran Church in Great Britain, which is in communion, in Porvoo communion with the Estonian Church, and this quarrel is still not over. So, contemporary reception, as I promised, the empirical research, I asked 12 people who were involved, and you saw them in the pictures, several of them also the bishops, but also a member of the consistory responsible for ecumenical relations. What's their attitudes of Porvoo agreement? And there are 6 questions, and I got answers from 9 people out of 12, and I'm happy that also both archbishops who are alive had answered this. So, what is your general assessment of the Porvoo agreement? Of course, the first answer is perhaps the most official, so to say, that communion is still very important, and in general, all of those people who answered were positive about it. So, what's the most important about the agreement? And I think, of course, the church fellowship, it's very important, but also this political social argument, which is the second answer here. Estonia was once again part of Europe, and in discussions in the beginning of 1990s, it was very important. It was like stepping into NATO or European Union somehow, and probably it was also this connecting link with the negotiations in 1930s when Estonian Church connected itself to a wider network against perhaps German Christianity. So, how important is actually the Porvoo agreement for Estonian church life? Closer to Scandinavian Lutheranism and Anglican Church, and theological discussion is important. But of course, there is a lot of dissatisfaction, especially among those people who were really preparing this contract, how it has been acting. There was more attention to Porvoo agreement immediately after the signing of it. And of course, we remember it when there are like 10 or 20 years from signing. But nowadays, perhaps the practical impact, it's not satisfactory for all those who were eagerly inside or trying to implement it. And of course, the visible sign, the most important visible sign, perhaps, that is written here in this long text, that we are speaking now about priest instead of teacher. We had this term of church teacher earlier, kirikuõpetaja, which was the common name for pastor, and now we are using priest as this second stage of ordination, and an understanding of ministry has been actually implemented really. And nowadays school children are in difficulties when they are asked whether there are priests in Lutheran Church, and it's quite surprising for them that they are also in Lutheran Church, not only in Anglican, not only in Catholic or Orthodox. So, and of course, this very concrete cooperation with Anglican Church, but also there are some people who think that there are too many Anglican customs sometimes practiced. So, although I think this cooperation with Anglican Church is not that visible. Have you changed your opinion? Yeah?
To 5 minutes?
Yes, of course.
Thank you.
So has the opinion changed over time? There are some people who are saying, no, it is not very calm and strong answer. But there are also people who are skeptical, saying that, well, we were too eager to implement it and too blue-eyed, so to say, too optimistic. And there are people who are saying also that nowadays we would not sign it. I'm afraid it's more difficult to sign it nowadays if we start again. And that's because of those liberal conservative issues. And there are some people who are really skeptical and particularly against the churches which have more liberal opinion. And these are, of course, people who are nowadays more conservative and have turned more conservative during those 25 years. So how could we proceed? The last question. And of course, the first answer here is the most important in a way, that it's also quite official. We do not give it away totally. We shouldn't break those ties, because there are also voices saying that we shouldn't have ties with other churches which have different opinions than us in those moral questions. I think there are also quite many practical proposals, interchurch implementation structures. We should connect to this evangelical Lutheran Church and Anglican Church discussions in Canada, for example, go further within discussions with other churches, and also perhaps to have better connections between Porvoo movement and this Loyenberg community. But also quite skeptical people saying that we haven't used all the opportunities, and we should simply use those opportunities that we have already 25 years. So a lot of room for improvement also under the current circumstances. And the last one is the most conservative opinion. So conclusions, just shortly, I think that besides the theological ideas, there were always such social political concerns like breaking the ties with the German church or breaking the ties with Soviet past, and also these high church, low church balances. And nowadays we hope that we will not go on with unions based on moral attitudes only, but we still try to keep this cooperation between the churches as the whole, not just between the groups inside the churches. And I think just very shortly, that's all. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Riho. I've lost my contact. I'm not sure whether you hear me or not.
Yes, I do hear.
Yeah, I'll try to regroup on the Zoom. But anyway, I then open the floor to questions, and I'm back again. Thanks very much. I really feel you have helped us immeasurably with these 6 questions that we could all put to what has been going on, and in fact in the whole broader question of ecumenism. So deeply appreciated. And it's always very helpful to have the concrete experience, the particular experience, because that's always so enlightening. And I wonder whether we'll be getting that also from the Latvian side later on. But anyway, the invitation is for you to participate in the discussion with Riho.
Oh, I see already in chat. Yes, Steve Knowers commented on Facebook. As I understand, Bishop Tiit was present at the ordination of Father Meelis, but did not participate in the laying on of hands. So there are 2 different explanations about this. The conservative circles also have shown the picture where Bishop Tiit is participating in the common prayer for Meelis. So it looks like participation in laying on of hands. So, and the current state is that the Bishop Tiit has apologized, mea culpa, maxima culpa, in church newspaper. So, but it was still, it's not solved yet. It appeared, this apology appeared only on Wednesday.
So Riho, there's even a question about fact, is it? What happened?
A little bit, yes. What is the matter of fact?
Yes, as you've now read the chats, I'm looking at the second from Pastor Jan, proposing a Porvoo exchange program like the Erasmus. Certainly, that to me that sounds like something that might move the train a bit, give it some speed. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, Porvoo exchange program would be very interesting.
I'll go to Matti with a question.
Yes, thank you, Juris, and thank you, Riho, for your presentation with a lot of information on the development in Estonian Church. I got interested in what you told about the change in vocabulary that the present word on the teacher, meaning the pastor, is in a process to be replaced by something else, like a priest. Can you say something more on that? Does that imply a change in understanding the presbyteral ministry? And what are the exact Estonian words? Opetaja and what is the one meaning the priest? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, it's always it's kind of showing the use of vocabulary, showing the attitude of people who are using it. There are some people who are still using this kirikuõpetaja and saying that it sounds nice, even if the ordination stage is priest. And in Estonian, we are using preester, which is common for priest in Orthodox and Roman Catholic Church. So I think that people who are using this understanding or using those words are also putting a bit different meaning into those words, and this ordination order is really trying to implement a bit different understanding to this word priest by using it. And of course, in the common language, we still have pastor as well, Lutheran pastor, pastor in Estonian, but the official term is priest, preester.
Matti, thanks very much for the question. It's very important. I was just thinking about the Latvian situation, that I haven't heard that formally the Lutheran Church in Latvia has adopted the word priest, even though in every other respect. Rinalds, do you know, has there been something in that line in Latvia?
No, I never heard that we officially would get to the word priest. We use a pastor. And garīdznieks, which is common word. I don't know in English how you translate garīdznieks.
Clergy.
Yeah, clergy. Yeah.
But Latvia, Riho, has gone another way, and I wonder whether Estonia is the same. We've gone a long way to getting the regalia, the cloth and all the rest of it's right in line with the Roman Catholic habit. Is it the same in Estonia?
Yes, you can see very different clothing for pastors and priests. For priests in Estonian Evangelical Lutheran Church, we have these two different habits, so to say, blacks or whites. So it was also kind of a big discussion earlier. We have two church agendas actually in the world.
And that brings me to one of the questions that suddenly shone for me when Jaakko was speaking, and he mentioned the word identity. And I'm just suddenly, it strikes me that that's a sort of hub around which we're all again floating. I mean, we all understand this denominational anxiety, which is very European and not very US and not very African and so on. But this question of identity, and I think for Estonia and Latvia, as I read our recent history, it's exactly the question of losing and rediscovering and having great anxiety about one's identity, nationally and religiously.
Yeah, it's very difficult to say what's the church identity based on that. I think that one part of our church identity is also diversity, which is positive. I think that we really allow very different views inside the church, but there are also other voices who say that perhaps we should have a bit narrower identity. Everything is possible. Everything is possible yet.
Yes. Well, again, with great thanks, Riho, both for your kind presentation, but especially for this word and information at a local level and a practical level of how Porvoo is working out in Estonia, and perhaps we'll be hearing from other places too. We'll now go to Dace Balvode, professor and dean of the Faculty of Theology in the University of Latvia, who has a time limitation, so she's going to be very exact about her presentation. And that's, I'll invite you to speak on what is not against us as far as this biblical background to ecumenism. Thanks, and with delight that you're here.
Thank you, and I hope indeed that I will be in time myself, stressing to everyone that I have to be on time. So I try to share my screen. I hope it works. And I also, so I hope you see my screen, the presentation.
Yes, we see it.
And do you see also that the slides change?
Yes.
Okay.
We have questions now.
Yes, that's good. I experienced it once. I spoke about something and the slides just didn't change. Nobody saw my presentation. The whole time there was only the first slide. So I hope it works now. So I hope to bring some different perspective to our common issue, and so I was interested in the hermeneutical questions, and I hope to move you to have the interest as well. And yes, so my question was how the biblical text appears in the ecumenical process of Porvoo. Let's say what is the contribution of biblical texts for the Porvoo conversations, for Porvoo statement. And first I wanted to reconstruct how the biblical passages were referred to in the discussions, and if there are any evidence of how it is done. But then I realized that the reconstruction would probably take months at least, or some more months, or if not years, and decided as the first step I take towards my aim would be to start with the Porvoo statement itself, to see how the biblical passages appear in the argumentation of Porvoo statement. What is the function of biblical texts in Porvoo ecumenical statement? So, so I will try to, or the first thing I will do is to, I will collect the information and look at the hermeneutical implementation for more document, and then I will try to find out how is the usage of these passages an enrichment for the meaning of the biblical text. So basically, I would like to ask what role the biblical text plays in the ecumenical dialogue. Do we need the Bible to be ecumenical? Do we need the Bible in all these ecumenical processes? So, first, I would like to show you which passages of biblical texts have been chosen and where in the statement, in the Porvoo statement. So probably everyone knows that Porvoo statement consists of 5 parts. There's first part which sets the document in the scene, in historical and today. And chapter 2 explains the understanding of the church. Chapter 3 speaks about belief and practice, common for Anglicans and Lutherans. Chapter 4 deals with the question of episcopal ministry and succession. And finally, chapter 5 contains the Porvoo Declaration. And I actually wanted to ask, where would you expect the biblical quotations appear? But I already show you now the chart, so you know already the answer. And you can see that the that the need for biblical expressions is in the second part, in the part about the church, about the definition of church. There are 34 quotations, paraphrases, and allusions to find. So that means that basically the role of biblical texts in Porvoo's statement is to help to explain the understanding of the church. But there are no quotes, for example, in the declaration part. And I will deal now, because of reasons of time, with this ecclesiological part of the document. If you look closer at the biblical text quoted, then we can discover that the ecclesiology of these Anglican Lutheran documents is mostly based in Pauline theology. The leader among the quotations is definitely Corpus Paulinum, with 25 references. Most of these quotations are from letter to the Ephesians, total 7 times. Then 6 times the first letter to the Corinthians occurs, if you count also allusions that speak of the body of Christ. Most of the references are paraphrases. Direct quotations are only used 4 times, one of which is quotation within the quotation. By the way, the letters in the letters Iekavas, could you help me?
Brackets.
In brackets, yes. The letters in brackets mean the if this is paraphrase or quotation or allusion. So I tried to somehow mark it. Yes, and the reference to Old Testament in the Porvoo statement is used only once. And it seems that it is remembered by liturgy in the consecration of bishop via chant Veni Sancte Spiritus, which leads to reference to Isaiah 11 about the Spirit of Lord who shall rest upon the chosen one. So it seems that the Old Testament doesn't play a big role in this document, at least. I found it very interesting that the biblical language helps to formulate the common understanding in the of the ecclesiology of the statement. There could be in some quotes of confessional declarations used instead, for example. Most of the expressions speaking of the church in the document are formulated in the first person plural. And this connects the we of this text directly to the statement in the biblical quote. Here is one example of how it is done. It's from para 17, and I quote, in baptism, the Holy Spirit unites us with Christ in his death and resurrection. And then these are these passages in brackets. And in the Eucharist, we are nourished and sustained as members of the one body by participation in the body and blood of Christ. 1 Corinthians 10, 16, 17. So if we would check the quotations, the biblical texts, then we could see that also there is used, the Paul uses we, and this we corresponds very tightly with this we in the statement, Porvoo statement. So you can see here the quotation from Romans as an example, but also other texts from which are referred to in the Porvoo statement to this first person perspective are directly applied to the current community or community behind the statement text. I find it very interesting hermeneutical approach. And besides that, Porvoo statement shows twofold hermeneutical work. The biblical text definitely is used in the function of common base to which the different partners of agreement refer. The statement itself doesn't bring much explicit biblical hermeneutics. Still, it declares in scriptures, declares the scriptures as in para 32, stating the principal beliefs and practices which Anglicans and Lutherans have in common as a common base. We accept the canonical scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be sufficient, inspired and authoritative, a record and witness, prophetic and apostolic to God's revelation in Jesus Christ. The end of quotation. So definitely the biblical texts, using the biblical texts in definition of the church is certainly an application of this declarative statement. On the other hand, the biblical expressions give the language to describe the church in idealistic and metaphoric or poetic way. So these are probably definitions of the church which are easier to agree on. And I don't want to say with that the authors of the text have chosen the easier way. I find it a more cleverer way. But I would rather emphasize that to emphasize the helpful role of the biblical text, which can give language to ecumenical statements. There can, of course, also be negative usage of biblical text, stressing the separation from others, for example. But in the case of Porvoo, it seems that for hermeneutical decisions, there is eschatological key used. As eschatological line as more important line of the biblical tradition, which shows what is the God's purpose for this world, for the church. And it is unity, God in all. And this works as a tool for the biblical critique of biblical texts to weigh the different biblical expressions. And now I would like to draw your attention to two examples, to get more concrete, of the interpretation of the biblical text in Porvoo statement, to look how, and I call it enrichment of the meaning of biblical passages take place. So we can see here how the Porvoo statement refers to biblical passages, giving some new meaning of the biblical expressions. Here I quote from Paras 22:23, and I hope you can read these texts. The words marked in green are words where I see the allusion to biblical text. This is not direct quotation. I consider this as allusion to 1 Corinthians 12. So this text about unity and diversity and gifts of Holy Spirit. And here I present the allusions of the text from 1 Corinthians 12, where you can see the similar expressions for which I consider a source for these expressions in Porvoo statement. So surely in the text of Porvoo statement there is not a direct quote of the Pauline text, but the language certainly is influenced by the biblical metaphors. And the readers of New Testament will remember the first context of Pauline's statements. Paul speaks in this text about spiritual gifts. There is a problem of in Corinthian church, which is the question which is the most important gift. How can a real spiritual person be recognized? And in the chapters 12 to 14, Paul explains then how he considers the spiritual gifts, that the most important is love, that speaking in tongues is good, but not for community, and how the different spiritual gifts can work together as one body. The Porvoo statement brings the expressions of body of Christ and differences and diversities in a different context. It is not a question of ecstatic or charismatic signs of presence of the Spirit, but here it is the diversity and unity of practices and theology, which is also some kind of gift to the church. Porvoo statement also brings the metaphor body of Christ, which served in Pauline text for the practical regulation of life in the specific church in the specific Corinthian church. In the Porvoo statement, it gets a different meaning. It is much more in connection to eschatological hope. Body of Christ is instrument and foretaste of the kingdom. So it changes this metaphor to expression for universal church. You see this enrichment, I would say, enrichment of the meaning which Porvoo statement gives to these biblical expressions. And by the way, if we would look at the history of interpretation of 1 Corinthians 12, then we could see that the most of authors stressed some kind of humbleness, which is connected to this spiritual idea of spiritual gifts, of diversity. That no one should be too proud that he or she owns all the gifts. It's always only part. So you need the others. And I found it also a very interesting idea for ecumenical dialogue.
That's for you to successfully move on to the next assignment that you have. Perhaps you could conclude in about 3 minutes. Is that all right?
I'll do so, yes. I wanted to show another example, and here is direct quotation from Ephesians. And what we would see here is that the shift is from that Ephesians speak about two parts, Jewish and non-Jewish believers, and how they are brought together. And of course, there is a shift of meaning in Porvoo statement. It speaks only about churches, and the question is if it is all right to skip the first meaning, to skip the history of the interpretation, and to apply so directly the biblical texts. From all that, I would like to come to conclusions or summing up what I want to say. So I have to move the...
We see it.
Yes, that's great. So you can see that you can speak also without the Bible. The three parts of the Porvoo statement do it. But biblical text can be, and as it is shown by showed by this Porvoo statement, it can be very helpful to speak about special issues, especially where it is hard to find common language. So I found it that the biblical text as common base can provide language for ecumenical dialogue, especially speaking on sensitive issues. Also, the biblical text can help to define the community, to find some new identity for the community in ecumenical dialogue. It can help to develop this new identity. And third, there is need, of course, if we do so, if we use the Bible, there's need for hermeneutical key, as we see also from Porvoo statement. The hermeneutical key we agree on as a criteria for weighing the biblical expressions. And fourth, the enrichment of meaning of the text in this process must be taken into account. It will just happen. So that's why but it is important not to forget about the history of interpretation, or Wirkungsgeschichte, if you want. It is ideally it should be recalled here. It should be not forgotten. So.
Thank you very much, Dace. I always find it so refreshing that we look at the use of the Bible in church documents, and you've done it for us a very useful and masterful examination of the documents that we're concerned with. By the way, the things that I hear from you, it just troubles me no end. I wonder whether you also are troubled by, you call it enrichment, I'm not sure. But anyway, Pastor Jojan, you have a question.
Yes, Dr. Vallode, thank you for, I've read the Porvoo Declaration and the Common Statement a few times now, and I never realized how little Bible there is there. I'm actually disappointed. And I'm disappointed because you'd think on both sides of the spectrum, there's the Anglican, there's Hooker, three-legged chair, scripture, tradition, reason. There's in 39 articles, the sufficiency of Old and New Testament. There's the Lambert 4 points, and the first point is the Old and the New Testament are the scriptures. Everything necessary for salvation is there. And then you have Sola Scriptura as well on the Lutheran side. And then apparently when the two come together, it's very limited. And like I say, it's more of a remark and a sudden epiphany, if you will, that actually I'm a little disappointed in the Porvoo Common Statement on that point. Anyway, thank you.
Pastor, how do I pronounce your name so that I'm saying it correctly?
Jojan.
Jojan. I appreciate your question. I have exactly the same question. I mean, I'm shocked, by the way, and so I'm delighted that you've pointed out our poor performance. Anyway, how do you handle Jojan's question?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's really. It was very interesting for me to discover with the Porvoo statement how helpful the language of biblical expressions can be, but might be that we use, I don't know if it is true, that we use the biblical language not so much. That might be that is connected of how we are thinking about the church, of how we are thinking about the whole process, ecumenical process, and for that actually I found that the Porvoo statement does it very nicely actually to go back to the biblical text, to this language there, to this understanding of church in the biblical text, and reminding us about that. I would say what was really surprise to me was rather the usage of the Old Testament. It doesn't play any role at all. Yes, I have my family home. This was rather a surprise to me. Yeah, I don't know.
That's why, as a Lutheran, let alone Anglican, would you ever be surprised that we have no use for the Old Testament? I mean, when have we used the Old Testament?
We learned something. Okay, now everyone is participating at this presentation now. Sorry about that. Please. I say always that the animals, they know that they have to work also, and they appear always when you are online. But I think we learned something in the 20th century about the exegesis, about the Bible, and also how to try to not to lose the also the common basis with the Jewish people of God. So I think, and I would say it is yes. What I didn't say at the end was actually some kind of appeal to think about ecumenical process as very open process, not only dialogue within the church. And I think that just last years, this situation we are, the whole world is in today, shows us that we should try to find the friends within the church, first of all, of course, but within our society, within different groups. So.
But again, I mean, Pastor Jojan's question was about what you so masterfully pointed out for us, that out of the 5 clauses or sections, only 2 even remotely come up with any usage of the Bible. I mean, isn't that, especially on, organizational things? I mean, this idealism about unity and all the rest of it, that's neither here nor there. But when you come to the nitty-gritty, which is the problem we heard from Rico about how the practice gets to be very difficult, I would have thought we'd have used more Bible on the administrative and organizational and declarative things.
I think that it's the document is very careful to argue with Bible, to put biblical biblical statements as an argument. It uses rather the biblical statements, as I said, as a language to speak about the common, and that's why it appears in this more theological thinking about how we describe the church and so, and not in the where it is where the questions are we should do things. So that's.
But isn't that another way of saying we really don't believe in the Bible that can help us solve ecumenical things?
I don't want to say that.
Anyway, unless there's a very quick question, we have about a minute. I will let you go to your next assignment. But anyway, again, Dace, it was simply delightful to have this mirror of our use of the Bible put to our faces, and I think it should make us think when we go about these documents and these agreements and these ecumenical statements. Do we really believe, let alone the Bible, but even the Holy Spirit, but we really believe in administration and organization? So thank you. I noticed that we've been given a massive coffee break now, and it's for a whole hour. And we return at 1:40 for the second half of our conference. And I really hope that wherever you are, you've got something lined up for this hour, that you can not do other paperwork, but really rest and have a good lunch and then come back refreshed. I personally found the morning session very helpful in many ways, and also, of course, very interesting. I personally have been part of the Porvoo life and Porvoo events and Porvoo discussions, both when I lived outside of Latvia and in Latvia as the priest at the Anglican Church in Riga, and have gone through the several discussions that have taken place here in Riga with the Lutheran Church that is not a part of the Porvoo Agreement, although originally the Lutheran Church of Latvia outside of Latvia was one of the very active parts of the discussions by our dean in England. The other question that came up, Sally Barnes had to leave early, and she wondered whether the papers would be available in a printed form. I was just wondering, Valdi, you could tell me if there's any thought given to printing these lectures, these presentations in our university publication, Celj, because listening to the morning's presentations, it seems to me that these materials are very, very helpful and in many ways register extremely important aspects of the historical background and development of the Porvoo events for Latvia and for the church in Latvia.
Yes, thanks for asking. We have been thinking of actually publishing a monograph next year to include all the papers. Yeah, so there will be a published version of these articles.
Yeah, a monograph, of course, is one way of doing it, but the other would be, in fact, to make one of the issues or part of the issue of Celj.
Oh yeah, that's one of the ways. Thanks. Yeah. But we will publish them. Definitely, we will publish them. Sally, I think, wants to.
No, you're back. I thought you were gone.
Well, I am. No, I came back. I was only going for an hour because I had another Zoom call booked that I couldn't miss. I particularly wanted to hear. Dace.
Yes.
And of course, I got into hers for 5 minutes and then had to go. And I would really wonder if I was very interested in the biblical things that she was putting, and I would like to have a look at her paper if she's got it, if she could send it to me.
I'm sure she'd be more than delighted make that available.
I'd love to see the others too, but I heard all those as well.
Yeah.
Took notes, but hers, of course,
Sure.
I had to go. Thank you.
So we we're ready to go for our afternoon session. Again, welcome to everyone, and I'm happy that we have returned in such a wonderful gathering. It's now the turn of Laima Geikkinen, professor at the University of Latvia, Faculty of Theology, and her topic, Ecumenism and 3 Lutheran churches in Latvia. Laima.
Thank you for the opportunity, and I will try to share with you my presentation. Oh, I am not permitted to share.
Why?
Host must allow me.
Now you're a co-host.
Okay, thank you. I see. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Now you are you see my presentation, yes?
Right.
Okay. Okay. This presentation is prepared for a conference dedicated to the principles of the Porvoo Declaration and the community. Its motto is visible unity and ecclesial diversity. Referring to this statement, I would like to put forward the thesis of my presentation that Lutheran churches in Latvia are ecclesiastically diverse, but not visibly united. Currently, I'm performing the duties of a deputy in the Riga City Council, and within the framework of these duties, I have to face situations when issues that coincide with religious content, processes, or phenomena have to be solved. The most pressing case at the moment is the question of St. Peter's Church ownership in Riga. It seems that it may be simpler than the position that the church should belong to the church with small capital and the church with big capital. However, as we delve into the problem, a number of issues arise. One of them is which church to transfer ownership to. Riga St. Peter's Church has a long and complicated history, but here I will only add that 3 Lutheran churches are eligible for this church building. If ecumenism in all Lutheran churches were to conform to the defined principles of ecumenism, then the question of property rights would probably be resolved a long time ago. As you know, there are more than 34 religious organizations registered in Latvia. About half of them are various Christian denominations, 5 of which are Lutheran, or even 6. Latvian Lutheran Evangelical Church, called LELB in Latvian, and headed by Archbishop Jānis Vanaks. German or Evangelical Lutheran, German Evangelical Lutheran Church in Latvia, where are 5 congregations in this church, Estonian and Russian congregations, as well as Augsburg Faith or Lutheran congregations, and the so-called Exile Church or congregations of the Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church worldwide, or LELB. It is often necessary to look for mutual ground internationally in one tradition in order to demonstrate to the secular society the unity in its faith, ethics, and service. Ecumenism has a long history that reaches back to foundations of the Catholic or Universal Church, As in other world religions, Christianity does not have a unified, homogeneous theology and practice. Unity has been the principal theme of Christian ecumenism from the World Missionary Conference in Edinburgh in 1910 onward. The quest for Christian unity has manifested itself in 6 principal forms or types of Christian unity. I'm sorry. Unity of faith. At a minimum, unity of faith among Christians is a common expression of faith in Jesus Christ as the way, the truth, and the life, as is mentioned or expressed in Gospel of John, chapter 14, verse 6. A more advanced Trinitarian expression of faith is a self-definition of the World Council of Churches as a, quote, a fellowship of churches which confess the Lord Jesus Christ as a God and Savior according to the scripture and calling to the glory of the one God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, end of quote. This is one of the most difficult principles of unity to implement. One manifestation of such ecumenism is the Apostles' Creed, which has become the unified creed of the Western Church. Here we can say that all Latin churches in Latvia are united in faith through the Apostles' Creed. The next one principle is institutional unity. Returning to the fact that there are 5 or even 6 Lutheran churches in Latvia, it is possible to outline the, in brackets, and then unity of the institutions of these churches. In 1999, 9 independent Lutheran congregations in Latvia merged into one church, which was named the Confessional Lutheran Church. The self-identity of this church is described in the following quote, which can be found on the church website. Quote, the reason for this was differing views on fundamental issues of Christian teaching and practice. The Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church generally follows the direction of modern ecumenism, especially the Roman Catholics, while the Confessional Lutheran Church has a denominational stance. The denominational direction in Lutheranism emphasizes that until consensus is reached on Christian teaching, church fellowship is not possible. First, it is determined by the Bible, and second, such fellowship creates uncertainties that threaten faith, end of quote. On May 27, 1997, 6 congregations agreed on joint service and 2 more pastors were ordained, and Gundars Bakus and Uģis Sildiks, in addition to the existing Ilārs Plūme, Uldis Fandēvs, and Kārlis Bušs. In 2008, after disagreements, some pastors left the Confessional Lutheran Church and joined the Evangelical Lutheran Free Church in Latvia. In the case of church ownership, there were been mergers and withdrawals from various international church unions. The German Evangelical Lutheran Church in Latvia is a union of congregations registered in Latvia as a church, one that has maintained services in German for years and has cultivated German Lutheran culture. September 28 in 2021 addressed to a German Evangelical Lutheran Church in Latvia, stating that Evangelical Church in Germany, and it was addressed by Evangelical Church in Germany to this Latvian German Lutheran Church, that Evangelical Church in Germany is terminating financial and personal support to German Evangelical Lutheran Church in Latvia. It was this support that was central during the years of this German Evangelical Lutheran Church in Latvia independence, and German Evangelical Church treated this Latvian German church as its diaspora church and provided the congregations with the necessary pastor who was sent to Latvia from Germany, funding for its maintenance. This forms the continued existence of this church and its identity. This decision was taken because German Evangelical Lutheran Church in Latvia joins the Lutheran Evangelical Church, Latvian Lutheran Evangelical Church, or Vanags Church, taking over its position against other churches, rejecting it as heretical non-Lutheran churches, at least in its official documents. In Latvia, there has been an attempt to unite this Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church and Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church worldwide, which are the united heirs of the Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church, separated due to the Soviet occupation during Second World War. Merger talks took place in the early 1990s, but they broke down because no agreement was reached on issues concerning women's ordination and the participation of homosexual persons into worship and sacraments. As a result, we have the Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church, which joins the Conservative International Lutheran Council as the 28th Synod of this church in Ruoja in August 2021, and withdrew from the Union of European Protestant Churches. In turn, the Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church worldwide, with its own identity, which is described as follows: the Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church worldwide is a member of the World Lutheran Federation, the World Council of Churches, and the Conference of European Churches. Since the 18th century, there has been an Estonian Lutheran congregation in Riga, which officially continued its activities even during the Soviet era. Another Estonian Lutheran congregation operated in Alūksne. The Riga Estonian Peter and Pavel Evangelical Lutheran Congregation is currently operating in Riga. The Church of the Estonian congregation was once the Church of Jacob. The Aviso Concert Hall was one Lutheran church after the construction of the large Orthodox cathedral. Back in 2000, in St. John's Church. There is a congregation of the Russian Lutheran Church in Latvia under the leadership of Pastor Pavel Levushkans. From the list of specific facts, it can be seen that Lutherans in Latvia still have a long way to go to implement the principle of institutional unity of ecumenism, not only for property rights and pragmatic reasons, but to become a visibly unified church for the world. Next principle is unity of worship. This is the most widely used principle of ecumenism among various Christian denominations in Latvia. It is emphasized that Latvia is one of the most favorable countries for ecumenism. However, going into the principles of ecumenism, it is clear that this is an uncritical self-understanding of ecumenical cooperation. In addition, ecumenical services most often show paternalistic treatment of smaller Protestant denominations. Pentecostal churches have been ignored for a long time. Brackets, perhaps because of their decentralized structure, which hinders the identification of a particular legitimate representation. Thank you, Juris, for helping.
Laima, 5 minutes, is that okay?
Yeah, thank you, because confessional Lutherans are also not involved in and or do not participate of worship. The ministry of clergy of different genders in ecumenical worship is problematic too. Next principle is ministerial unity.
We lose you. We keep losing you. We keep losing your voice broadcast.
The denominational operates in the chaplaincy service to provide pastoral care for the military or prisons. In Latvia, this principle can be seen in the service of chaplains both in healthcare institutions and in the military service. A rare event for Latvia's Christian environment should be noted here: the confirmation of women in the service of military chaplains, the graduation of Estere Tumovica and Anna Dobele, graduates of the Faculty of Theology of the University of Latvia, as chaplains of the military, police, and land forces battalion. And Estere Tumovica became head of chaplain service or these capellans in the military field in Latvia this year. And it's really very interesting fact what must be studied a bit deeper, but causes and decision was made about this fact. Next principle is unity of action. Unity of action is most typically reflected in common action on social, economic, environmental, and political issues. This aspect of unity is at the heart of the World Council of Churches. In Latvia, Christians are able to agree not only with each other, but also with secular society. For example, by organizing Taizé Youth Days in Riga. However, the most visible joint action projects have been related to the, in brackets, non-ratification of the Istanbul Convention, support for virtue in question marks, for virtue amendments, the pro-life and traditional family campaign, the prayer breakfasts, the pilgrimage to Aglona. Ecumenical activities such as church night was initially compromised in terms of ecumenical principles because the Riga Anglican Church has been denied the opportunity to participate in the organization and implementations of the event. Following the interventions of the Anglican Church at the international level, this interface conflict or misunderstanding was smoothed out. And last one is, but not less important, or maybe most important, is sacramental unity. Sacramental unity is often defined as a restoration of communion, as it is stated in Porvoo Declaration. The restoration is sacramental unity is usually closely linked with unity of faith even on a minimal basis, as a prerequisite. In multilateral ecumenism, there have been successes in the mutual recognition of baptism among Christian denominations in some countries. It is interesting that in Latvia, in the case of Lutheran Evangelical Church, Latvian Lutheran Evangelical Church and Latvian Lutheran Evangelical Church worldwide, even sacramental unity or the opportunity to participate in the Holy Communion event is sometimes not possible. This is my own experience in some cases. In opposite, under the Porvoo Agreement, Holy Communion is offered in all member churches, the Nordic and Baltic Lutheran churches and the Anglican churches in Britain and Ireland are in full communion with each other and called to share a common life in mission and service, as it is mentioned on the website of Porvoo Communion. And it's very interesting that I have this positive experience of common communion with Roman Catholics in Netherlands, but sometimes has not this positive experience here in Latvia among Lutherans. Quote, after 20 years, we can say that in many ways, we have particularly experienced growth in unity and friendship. On the other hand, we have also experienced the challenges in living in communion. The mutual bonds in our common Christian faith, ministry, and friendship within our communion have proved to be strong enough to deal with difficult questions, which have proven to be even church dividing at times, not only between the churches, but also in the churches. End of quote. We can try to understand reasons of church division in Latvia by comparing belonging of local denominations to global organizations and their attitude to Porvoo Agreement. We can see in this table that
Laima, we have to leave a few minutes for questions.
Oh, okay. It's I will finish very soon. You see that different churches has different affiliations to different global organizations, and of course, as Juris mentioned at the beginning, that attitude to Porvoo and membership in Porvoo Agreement is different for different churches. And it would be one cause for this different complications within ecumenism. Another one way to find reasons of unable to celebrate sacramental unity are differences in the defined sources and activities of particular organizations. And here you see, I just put together the credos and self-definitions of all different organizations, and we can see that there are differences in used adverbs and sources of theological statements. And this is again shows us that this 5-6 Lutheran churches cannot be united because they use different sources and different they have different self definitions. The main difference between the confessional Lutheran Church's treatment of historical Lutheran creeds and in case of both Lutheran churches worldwide and Latvian, before the two churches began to move away, they were very similar internationally and ecumenically. Both were members of the World Council of Churches in the world and the World Lutheran Federation. Since 1993, the Vanags Church, which is still part of the two organizations, has kept its activity in them to a minimum. In addition, in 2001, the LELB concluded an altar and pulpit communion with the world's leading conservative Lutheran church, the Missouri Synod. And LELB has joined the International Lutheran Council and Association of Conservative Churches. In 1993, both Latvian Lutheran churches were in the process of negotiating to join the Porvoo Declaration. LELB Worldwide Church joined it in 2014, but Vanags Church is still only observer. So both churches have taken steps in very opposite theological directions.
Laima?
Yeah, I finished with my conclusions. We can say say clearly that all 6 principles of ecumenism represented in relationships among Latvian Lutheran churches. Different churches belong to different organizations and have different attitude to Porvoo Agreement. And if we talk about Latvian Lutheran churches, then only one of them is active member of Porvoo community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laima. I think the upshot of all of that sounds to me that the Lutheran churches in Latvia need a Porvoo agreement of some kind.
Yeah, our local Porvoo agreement.
Yes. Well, we have a couple of minutes left for questions to Laima. Yeah, Riho.
Thank you. My picture of Latvian church life is now more diverse than it was earlier even. My short question is the sacramental unity. Between which churches we do have sacramental unity and between which we do not have?
I'm not sure that I will answer correctly, but it's in Lutheran perspective, it's depend on congregations. For example, in this Lutheran church worldwide, everyone accepted and could take part in a communion. For example, as a Lutheran, I cannot take part in a Roman Catholic.
No, the question, Laima, was about among the Lutherans.
Only Lutherans.
Of course, confessional, but maybe Robert, who participate here, can answer more precise as I. But as I understand the statements that confessionals do not allow to take part in their communion others. And there was a discussion in 2010, what I found on internet among Lutherans on possibility to have this communion in confessional church. And I found out that they do not allow to came Vanags Church members and Worldwide Church members because they ordained women and allow some unacceptable.
I suppose the big question really is whether the churches, the Lutheran Church outside of Latvia would be freely able to receive communion in the Latvian Lutheran Church in Latvia. Rinalds, maybe you have a question, or maybe you can answer this question.
Yes, for me, it would be interesting to know what is the reason for this doubt. I officially don't know any reason why someone can say that in Latvian Lutheran Church, people are not welcomed from Latvian Lutheran Church abroad for the Holy Communion. It would be very interesting, Laima, if you know something concrete, please say. Thank you for your I would say, one-sided view on the situation. It's not the moment that I can react on everything what I heard, unfortunately. But I would be very happy to know if you can say some reason, if you can say maybe main reasons why you, how you think, why the situation among the Lutherans, among us who are here also represented, are so bad in your point of view.
Why so bad? You know, every phenomenon is very complicated. We cannot say in black and white color that this is the main reason. I think there is a lot of historical and personalities play role in some aspects. And if I answer your question, there is no theological or official reasons why people cannot take place in a communion. That my own experience, it was years ago. I cannot remember the particular congregations, but this is depend from the pastor. And if pastor creates rules in his congregation according his own theological view, and sometimes it happens that people cannot join for some reasons. I don't know you. I never seen you here. From what part of, or from what church are you? This is not the church who provides this service. This kind of statements I've heard.
Laima, I think for the people who are not familiar with Latvia, very simply, Rinalds is right. I can't think of a situation where the Latvian Lutheran Church and the Latvian Lutheran Church outside of Latvia would not be able to participate in each other's Eucharist. It'd be very unusual. The other smaller congregations churches don't really count in Latvia, except the confessional Lutherans, and you've already pointed out that they would not permit other Lutherans in Latvia to participate in their Eucharist. So that the situation on the Eucharist is rather straightforward. It's really about all the other things that you mentioned where the unity is sorely lacking. We have to conclude this part, except that Dace wanted to say something.
Oh, I just wanted to make a short remark that indeed I didn't experience it myself, but I had heard reports that there are some pastors in Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church which require that the participants of the Holy Communion, that they would take part also, or they would have private confession with the pastor. And there have been cases where the participation at the communion was denied to those who didn't want to take part in this private confession. So I think there are big differences between churches, between parishes, probably in all three Lutheran churches, but also in Lelk. So I think might be this is the experience also Laima speaks about. So
yeah, I think she pointed out also that there are some obviously some pastors who have their own ideas and they play those out in their particular parish. Again, Laima, thank you very much for your presentation of one aspect of the situation of Lutheranism, not so much the Porvoo thing, but Lutheranism in Latvia. With a sort of 5-minute lead of time, We now go to our second session, and that is from Professor Valdis Tēraukalns of the Faculty of Theology at the University of Latvia, and his topic of the prehistory of the Porvoo Agreement in the last centuries, 20s and 30s. Valdi.
Hello, and nice to see you all. I will try to share my screen, and you will tell me if something is not working.
We have your screen.
Can you see my first slide?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay, so I will be looking into prehistory of the Porvoo Communion conversations, and I did some research in local archives here in Latvia, in WCC, World Council of Churches, archives in Geneva, and the Lambeth Palace Archive, which is Church of England archive in London, and then there are also original documents kept of these conversations from 30s. So, a religious context in 20s and 30s, well, most of us would probably know about some of the things I mentioned here. First of all, conversations between Nordic Lutheran and Anglican churches, reacting against condemnation of Anglican orders by Pope Leo XIII in 1896. Anglicans became anxious to establish their episcopal credentials. So their ecumenical dialogue started to be preoccupied with apostolic succession in relation to Lutheran, Old Catholic, and Orthodox churches. But relationships with Nordic Lutherans started already in 19th century and earlier, so it's quite an old phenomenon. And at the beginning, it was not easy for some Lutherans. Anglicans were too reformed, and in Finland they even censored English books because they were not Lutheran enough. And for some Lutherans in Nordic Europe, Northern Europe, Anglicans were too Catholic. Then in 20s, in 20s of 20th century, there was a birth of ecumenical movement. In 1920, Lambeth Conference, Conference of Anglican Bishops, issued an appeal to other churches to strive for visible unity by accepting episcopal order. Bishops themselves during the meeting were divided how to understand it, and there were different theologies behind. Then the same year, in 1920, there was also a call of ecumenical patriarchate, also a call for Christian unity, and it calls for close relationships between churches and theological schools, as well as for Christian denominations to study doctrinal differences in depth. But what is important here? Keyword is politics, and I will return to that again. Keyword is really politics, because Patriarchate was afraid that after collapse of Ottoman Empire, Turkish Republicans would force Patriarch to leave Istanbul. And so representatives of Patriarchate attended Anglican Lambeth Conference of 1920, and they also used visit to gain favor of influential British politicians. So it's not only religion playing role here, theology, but also very much politics. Then another factor, tension among traditions within denominations and different preferences in choice of ecumenical partners. Anglicans more than Lutherans have a pragmatic attitude towards confessional documents, and so Low Church Anglicans, they were eager to communicate more with with non-conformist churches, Baptists, Presbyterians, others, more high church Anglicans obviously were looking more to Orthodox, Old Catholic, and in some rare cases Roman Catholic side. Now, of course, scene is more diverse, as we know, because of charismatic movement and other tendencies in ecumenical scene. But definitely, it is about choice within different traditions. And also speaking about Lutherans, yes, Nordic churches, they are more high church traditional, but there are minority voices raised by revivalist movements inspired by Pietism, also in Finland, Norway, Sweden. And then political context. That's something we need to keep in mind. As I said, in the second half of 1930s, Latvian government hoped for economic and political rapprochement with England, which didn't happen. UK didn't want to make any commitment to guaranteeing security of the Baltic states. And when in 1935, government of Baldwin came to power, it continued policy of concessions in relation with Germany. This was political context within which Latvian government sought to intensify relationships between two countries, including contacts between Latvian and also English churches. And that's actually a beginning of these conversations between Latvian Lutheran Church and Church of England. In November 1935, ambassador of Latvian state in London, Zariņš, reported to Riga about his talks with Archbishop of Canterbury. And if you look to archive materials, it's always through embassy when these contacts have been made. And also Zariņš wrote to Ulmanis, authoritarian leader of Latvia in 30s, saying that, well, he had these talks with this Archbishop of Canterbury, and these were positive talks, and then he's asking what to do. And in the same fashion, Latvian Lutheran theologian Valdemārs Maldonis also wrote in a book on ecumenical conference of 1937 that England's political influence is really great over the world. And so head of the Church of England, Archbishop of Canterbury, also could be head of all evangelical churches. But he also then adds that probably it's not possible. So we need to keep in mind this political factor. Then some facts, conversations between Baltic Lutherans and Anglicans. Riho and Jaakko already mentioned some of them, and I told you about correspondence. Archbishop Greenbergs, as well as Ambassador Zariņš had with Church of England. Well, the first English-Baltic conference took place in March 1936 at Lambeth Palace in London, and English delegation was headed by Arthur Hedlem, Latvian delegation by Archbishop Greenbergs, and there was also Estonian delegation represented by Jaak Tau, who later lived in United Kingdom, and also Bishop Rahamägi. And then second English-Baltic conference was held in June 1938 in Riga and Tallinn in 2 sessions. And then at the end of these sessions, parties involved signed in Tallinn joint report in the form of a recommendation to the English, Latvian, Estonian heads of churches to formalize agreement. And what methods they use? Well, they compared different documents, church documents, and they also had references to 39 articles, for example, which is Church of England, Anglican, one of confessional documents, and also Augsburg Confession, as well as other documents, liturgies, for example. And with 39 articles, as we probably know, well, Anglicans would have various views, and High Church Party within Church of England it was not very happy with more Protestant character of this document. And also Headlam, he in these conversations, and also later on, he argued that they are not so important as Book of Common Prayer. And also some other members of delegation, they expressed similar view. Anglican delegation in 30s of 20th century who met with representatives of Church of Finland, they also expressed opinions that articles had always been articles of comprehension, not articles of exclusion. So here we can see some bits of Anglican inclusivity. Well, these were high days of Anglo-Catholic movement. And as you can see from documents of that time, some of Anglo-Catholics thought that, well, more reformed tradition will die out within Anglican Church. As we know, it didn't happen. It's much more complex, and days of Anglo-Catholicism in some ways are gone because of a split of the moment over women ordination and others and other issues, but definitely impact has been left, and episcopacy would be one of issues, even if 39 articles like Augsburg Confession would not talk about that issue. And yeah, Low Church Anglicans, of course, would be looking to 39 articles as a source of their tradition, and many views in between. Then, yes, Anglican delegation expressed also view about remaining differences, and these are, and then we can look into these. Lutherans, according to them, are more than Anglicans, emphasizing doctrinal justification by faith, and some of them said also predestination, which is not true actually, because Latvian Lutheran have never emphasized that. Second issue is confirmation, but that's interesting. Anglican delegation also noted that preparation for confirmation in Latvia and in Estonia is much more severe than it is with us. And as you know, in Anglican tradition, people are confirmed by a bishop. But again, historically, in centuries before, then there were very few bishops, especially outside UK. Confirmation was a rare occasion, especially in Europe. So there are inconsistencies here. Then so-called apostolic succession. Well, during these conversations, both terms are used: historical episcopate, which is a term used in Lambeth's quadrilateral, and also apostolic succession. And again, we need to remember that we are talking about high days of Anglo-Catholic movement, and to them, this was kind of mystical point, even and very, very important. What we understand by that now, of course, is discussion And Porvoo agreement is more open, more flexible. We will come to that. Diaconate, they are saying that it didn't exist as an order of ministry in the Baltic Lutheran churches, but there was the office of deacon. And also they say that while Anglicans lay stress on 3 orders of ministry, Lutherans chiefly regarded difference between bishop and pastor as one of function and activity rather than one of order. Then text of agreement of 1938, what does it say? It says about this mutual participation of bishops in the consecrations of new bishops. It says about mutual admission of communicants to Holy Communion, mutual attendance at the conferences of bishops, and baptism, as well as marriage of members of the other 2 churches who have not access to their own clergymen.
All this,
impact and
all this perhaps in 5 minutes?
Okay, yes, thank you for reminding. And then finally, we are moving, yes, to final part, impact and subsequent role. This agreement formed new opportunities for congregations in Latvian diaspora, as well as Estonian diaspora, to use church buildings, Anglican church buildings, and to have various contacts. And then in 1955, and this is important, Latvian Evangelical Lutheran Church, what was called Supreme Church Board, reaffirmed agreement of 1938, and it was just before visit of the delegation of Soviet clergymen to Great Britain. And Gustav Sturs, Latvian Lutheran Archbishop, he visited UK in 1955, and symbolically he also took part in communion service. And then later on, and we already talked about that in this seminar, there was Baltic Lutheran and Anglican involvement in Porvoo communion. Well, the remaining questions for discussion, what we can take from the history. First of all, issues behind the scene. And some of us from time to time taking part in church meetings, we know that most interesting things are talked about after meetings, drinking wine and tea. And the question is why not to bring them in the meetings. And so politics, be it large politics or church politics, issues behind the scene. And nowadays we can talk about the role of other ecumenical partners, Catholics, Orthodox, but question then is how consistent it is. And my feeling is that that Catholics and Orthodox are more honest and more consistent than some of the Protestants who, let's say, discover the Catholic faith or Orthodox faith. And what they mean by that. Yes, we need to take into scene church parties, different groupings within churches, and it's even more complex than in 20s and 30s, and issues of sexuality nowadays. And it's not only about more conservative Baltic Lutheran churches, also about, for example, Anglican evangelicals, conservative evangelicals resisting possible union with British Methodists after Methodist conference this year voted to allow same-sex marriages. Confirmation, I would call it right, still looking for theology and what does it mean today. It was Toronto a statement of Anglican liturgical commission, which recommended that for people baptized as adults, there is no need for confirmation. I totally would agree with that. The same I would say is that people who join For example, Anglicans from Lutheran Church also. There is no need for that. It was Anglican Bishop Buchanan who ironically wrote that it's also strange that Catholics joining Anglicans, they are not required confirmation. If we want to be consistent, they should be confirmed, because teaching of Catholic Church is very, very different from Anglican perspective. And do we really think that that bishop, if he confirms it, somehow more valid, better than if simply pastor does it? And there is no also historical reasoning behind that. Third, well, there is an inescapable diversity of ecclesiological models, and my argument would be exactly because if we want to be true to early church tradition, we need to see that it's a plurality of Christianities. And therefore, all this debate about succession, apostolic succession, and about Porvo versus Meissen or so on, really we need to ask whether it's not adiaphora, and can we look much wider to this issue, because there is inescapable diversity, and there is nothing non-Anglican or non-Lutheran in accepting, for example, ministers, be it bishops or pastors, who are not somehow ordained by what is meant by apostolic succession. And there is some flexibility in Porvo documents, but still there is very much concentration on offices and how historically justified it is really. And also whether we are not talking about things most people are not interested in churches. And we may end up if talking about things nobody is interested. It's like Catholics who had in the States recently a poll whether people are believing to transubstantiation, and answer, of course, is no. So I'm afraid it's very similar thing. Issues raised again by COVID crisis. For example, Lutherans already in 20s and 30s raised issue, and it was a tradition in Baltics and also, before 19th century by Anglicans. Ordination in some cases, emergency cases, not only by bishops, but also their representatives. So I think crises like COVID crisis against remind us that maybe what we had in the past is not so bad. So yes, I hopefully stirred up some of the questions for discussion, and I think my time is over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valdi. Appreciate especially that you addressed one of the important items of this whole conference with its headline, A Way Forward. And I think you already started indicating where the pressures are and the needs can be observed. I think you will permit me to provide about 5 minutes into Mark Chapman's time. We can go over a bit, I think, with Mark Chapman for a few questions to Valdis. If not, Zilgma, you wanted? Pastor Jojan.
Yes, sorry to come in at the last moment there. Thank you for this presentation. I'm glad you mentioned the word adiaphora. I was actually waiting for that. Adiaphora, non-essential. Well, that's not a good translation because we are discussing it, so in a way it is essential. Personally, I would prefer a more modern term in the sense of contextual, because I find it is more on the ground and it's more sensitive to needs. Why do you think that in these discussions, this principle, which is a confessional principle for Lutherans even, it seems that these discussions, these agreements steer away from that? Is it because of the adiaphora principle, of the contextual? It's almost as if the partners are scared that that would be too shaky, too uncertain, too flexible. Is it something like that, or what do you think?
Thank you, Jan.
Thank you. Well, it depends on topic. If we talk about ecclesiologies, and then we need to keep in mind also factor of Catholic and Orthodox participation in ecumenical dialogue, and some of the Protestants are afraid that somehow, if they will not respect Catholic or Orthodox ecclesiological ideas, then they will move away from ecumenical dialogue. But let's be frank, if we would follow that line, there will be no women ordination and forget about same-sex unions and so on. And also, which Catholic tradition we are talking about? Hans Küng, repressed by magisterium, who actually criticized the official Catholic teaching of priesthood and said that it has no historical background. We are talking about both liberation theologian and so on, or we are talking about official teaching, which is also changing, as we know, but very slowly. And the Roman Catholic Church also has started a process of discussions about way forward. And then, of course, always, yes, there are different historical backgrounds. If we talk about Northern Europe or Baltics or Germany, different versions of Lutheranism, and even more if we talk about Anglicanism or other Protestants.
Yeah, but as I understood, she can explain herself. Pastor Jojan, I think, was thinking about something else, namely the divide between traditionalists and contextualists, let's call it like that, that in these ecumenical discussions, somehow it seems beside the point to make ecumenism dependent on fixing your tradition. Why don't we place the church in its contextual setting and look at some of these things that so trouble us as adiaphora? And so that to be the point.
Yes, some of the ecumenical dialogues, like for example, Anglican Reformed dialogue text I read, they are talking that we need to be responsive to grassroots movements within churches, but again, what follows of that? Do we really accept, for example, that we can easily merge Meissen and Porvoo so far? Well, Mark will tell us more about that probably, but well, there is still this rhetoric of succession understanders, or this idea, even this idea of bishop as sign of unity, which also can be criticized as very kind of blurred and wide term, which is not working anyway. If we are talking about GAFCON bishops, conservative Anglican bishops in UK and USA, which are definitely not signs of unity or even historically. So I had to use terms which are not clear at all.
Okay, I think maybe when we come to the end of our day, after hearing Mark Chapman's presentation, some of these things, because it strikes me that really behind all of this is something completely different. None of this none of the items that really the churches bring up are to the point, I think, for most people in the church and outside the church, as it looks at unity and so on. But that's just my idea. But we're delighted that we can have Mark Chapman, who is a professor of history of modern theology at the University of Oxford, but also a long-time colleague and friend of the Faculty of Theology in Latvia. And there's been a long history of his and our participation in common things and common experiences and common programs. And so, Mark, we're delighted to have you with us, and then give the moment to you and your presentation on the unity problem as it comes out in the problem of bishops. Thank you very much again for being with us.
Thank you very much indeed. And I shall share a screen. And shame we can't meet in person. It would have been nice to come to Latvia again. But I will share my screen. And hope that works okay. And
we see it.
Good. Good.
We have it here.
Right. One of the things I want to continue in many ways from what Valdis was talking about is about how Anglicans have been fixated on bishops, even where many Anglicans try their best to avoid bishops as best they possibly can. Frequently, bishops, in theory at least, get elevated to the status of absolute necessity for a church to be a church, so they are not adiaphora. In my involvement with the Meissen process over the last few years, bishops continue to be the intractable problem, and we're going round and round in circles trying to find creative ways forward. But Anglicans are hemmed in by ecumenism, which is how so much of their identity has been created. Anglican identity is in many ways an identity that only comes from discussion with other churches. Now, the Porvoo Agreement itself is littered with references to ecumenical texts, as if they were kind of proof texts for Anglican statements of belief. Now, while that's a relatively modern phenomenon, it nevertheless functions always to constrain ecumenical consensus. Porvoo was, in Anglican terms, an aberration, at least for the churches of the British Isles, in that the agreement was actually reached for the simple reason that the Nordic and Baltic churches more or less kept a version of episcopacy that looked a little bit like the Anglican versions of episcopacy. Now, I don't want to rehearse arguments for or against the necessity of bishops. That's something that other people can get worried about. Instead, I want to do something really quite simple, to explore some of the origins of the term historic episcopate, which had come to define Anglicanism, at least by the time of the 1930s, through the Church of South India proposals. And that had really crucial implications for ecumenical relations between Anglicans and other churches, especially non-episcopal churches. By that stage, the Anglican Communion had really been recast into a denomination in which the historic episcopate had become really the key part of its identity. And that movement was described as the episcopalization of Anglicanism. What I'll try and do is to show that there are other models of Anglicanism, different from that kind of Lambeth Conference Anglicanism, and those continued to regard Anglicanism as a kind of Protestantism adapted for its particular context. But all of that was supplanted by a kind of visceral fixation on the centrality of episcopacy as of the essence of the church. Now, a good illustration of all this is the kind of Anglicanism offered by people like Frederick Hood, an Anglo-Catholic principal of Pusey House in Oxford just after the First World War. And he was in many ways a good representative of a conservative form of Anglo-Catholicism. in 1935, he published a strong defense of what might be regarded as the maximal understanding of historic episcopate. He cited a work written just in response to the 1888 Lambeth Conference, a work by Bishop Stubbs. The historic episcopate, said Stubbs, is of the very essence of the Church of England and could not be suffered to be called in question by anybody or individual desirous to be incorporated in our communion. So at least for a certain type of Anglo-Catholic, episcopacy alone functioned as the very centerpiece of Anglican self-understanding. And the term historic episcopate found its way into common usage in the Anglican Communion at the Third Lambeth Conference of 1888. It was one requirement for union with other churches, along with the scriptures, the two dominical sacraments, and the ecumenical creeds. Now, given that the other 3 points would be acceptable to virtually all doctrinally orthodox sacramental churches, it was always the historic episcopate that was to become the key distinguishing feature of Anglican identity. It's important to note, however, that there was no clarification of precisely what was meant by historic episcopate at the 1888 Lambeth Conference. For many people, they couldn't cope with that kind of vagueness. And in the years that followed the First World War, it was in many ways a kind of clarification of what historic episcopate meant that caused many of the problems. And that takes me to another Lambeth Conference, the most famous one, Lambeth 1920. The claims of those 4 points of 1888 were given an enormous boost following the famous appeal of the 1920 Lambeth Conference, the gathering of Anglican bishops, which laid the foundations at an international level for ecumenical Anglicanism in the context of the post-First World War settlement. The emphasis was again on the historic episcopate as something to be graciously received through the apostolic rite of the laying on of hands, all the same problems you get in the Porvo Declaration. While there was no denying the spiritual reality of the ministry of those churches that don't express episcopacy, the appeal expresses its hope that would lead ministers who have not received it, episcopacy, to accept a commission through episcopal ordination. For many, the Anglican Communion was understood as the kind of ecclesiastical equivalent for the British Commonwealth that was beginning to develop into a kind of federation of self-governing dominions. The Lambeth Appeal amounted to a call for a kind of League of Nations for the churches, so that denominations, including Anglicanism, at least in its Protestant English form, would cease. There were other changes affecting ecumenism in the post-First World War. Much of earlier pan-Protestantism as well, in which had been represented by many Anglicans in pre-war years by assimilating German liberal scholarship. A lot of that had run into the sands because of its association with Germany's war aims. And after the First World War, Anglo-Catholicism had risen into the ascendant because it resisted liberalism, and it had been on the side of the Orthodox as well during the First World War. That said, one of the ironies of Anglican ecumenical involvement is that the commitment to church unity expressed in the Lambeth Appeal in 1920 was at the same time a strong affirmation of Anglicanism as a kind of exclusive kind of church based on its allegiance to the historic episcopate. The very impetus towards stating the minimum requirements for ecumenism helped shape a global denominational identity, which made it far less willing to accept and to embrace its historic Protestantism. So let me just illustrate this with a couple of examples. Now, the main spur to ecumenical cooperation came from the problems that emerged through missionary expansion through the 19th century. Some of the key features that had originally set European churches and denominations against each other in matters like church government or liturgical practice, those came to be seen as increasingly irrelevant in the completely new context represented in Africa, as well as in South and East Asia. Some of the earliest efforts at ecumenical cooperation took place in India. For instance, the character on the left there, Lal Bahari Dey, had proposed a union for Bengal on the basis of Episcopal, Presbyterian and Congregationalist principles in order to free Christianity from what he regarded as its European forms that constrict the proclamation of the gospel in his view. In turn, by the outbreak of the First World War, reunion conferences were becoming more and more frequent in India as Anglicans and representatives of other denominations discussed possible routes towards reunion. By 1919, the well-known conference held at Tranquebar resulted in a manifesto proposing a scheme for reunion that was agreed by Anglicans as well as the South India United Church, Presbyterians and Congregationalists. With the renewed emphasis on reunion after the Lambeth Conference, there were moves towards a much more substantial set of proposals to bring about the new United Church. So in 1929, the Bishop of Madras noted the gospel imperative that all might be one was the principal consideration. The proposed scheme of reunion, which was completed in March 1929, emphasized the role of the Spirit in promoting the bond of peace. The pattern of faith for the new church was identical to that of the Lambeth Quadrilateral and the Lambeth Appeal, which would require the acceptance of the Apostles and the Nicene Creeds, as well as the dominical sacraments of baptism and Eucharist. More complex, however, was the issue of church order, especially the historic episcopate. Now, while there was acceptance of the historic episcopate in a constitutional form as part of the basis of reunion, this doesn't mean that there was any intention thereby to imply or to express a judgment on any theory concerning episcopacy. Now, in formulating the very final proposals, the Bishop of Bombay had long advocated the centrality of the historic episcopate for any unity. Ministers in the new church, he said, should accept a commission through episcopal ordination. Now, that point was modified in 1926, which allowed the proposals to go forward, but which caused significant problems for many Anglicans. Until such time as all bishops and clergy conformed to the historic order, in other words, until such time as they'd all been ordained by bishops, there was to be a 30-year interim period. So while in the long run, all those in ministry would be episcopally ordained ministers, there would be exceptions until that time. So the chief problem with the church, with the South India Church proposals, was that the interim period, rather than the question of episcopacy per se. So just again, a couple of short illustrations about the kind of opponents you get. Opponents to the proposals, the historic episcopate had come to be treated as an all or nothing affair. There simply could be no compromises, even for 30 years. So despite the acceptance of the centrality of the episcopal to the episcopacy in the proposals, the interim measures meant that there were exceptions to the general principle of an episcopally ordained ministry. Congregations, in fact, wouldn't have been affected. They could vote not to have a minister ministering to them until such time as they'd been ordained. But nevertheless, that interim period contradicted, according to people like Frederick Hood, contradicted the preface to the Ordinal, the Book of Common Prayer Ordinal, as well as the Constitution of the Church of India, Burma and Ceylon, as well as ruling out reunion with Rome. Consequently, he said, great harm will be done to the very cause which we all have at heart if this scheme is approved without drastic revision. This sort of opposition reveals that the South India proposals on episcopacy, however limited they were in practice, functioned as a kind of red rag to the Anglo-Catholic bull. The very identity of the church was at risk. For many Anglo-Catholics, episcopacy had come to function as the guarantee for the church's authority against any encroachment, either from an increasingly secular state or from other denominations. As N.P. Williams, Lady Margaret Professor of Divinity in Oxford, one of the leading Anglo-Catholics at the time, he said this: I venture to suggest that such a geographically conditioned priesthood that you got in India would be practically as productive of irritation as it would be theoretically incapable of justification. For many, there was a fear that it marked the thin end of the wedge, as the irregularity of non-episcopally ordained clergy presiding over Eucharists might set the pattern for future developments elsewhere, even possibly in England. One of the harshest critics of the South India proposals was the poet T.S. Eliot, who attacked what he regarded as the denial of Christian truth, which could never be dependent purely on context, he said. Furthermore, what happened on one side of the globe could easily affect the church at home. Between the missionary field, he said, and the home field, there can be no radical difference. If it is accepted in India, it will inevitably be proposed in England. Not only logic will compel it, but circumstance. A precedent will have been established, the inconsistency will become intolerable, and we shall be told that if we do not conform to the precedent of India, it is we who will be responsible for the consequent disorder. Now, the support that had been given by some English churchmen to the South India proposals raised the question of whether the Church of England shall survive or perish. In particular, the 30-year interim period was nothing more than an amiable masquerade, he said, and would deny the ideal of a national church representing all people. As a church, it would only be a shell. And just briefly, just to say, there were other ways that Anglicans did ecumenism that were always ignored in the 1920s and 30s. Some Anglicans held a quite different understanding of the historic episcopate. I'll just give you a short example of the General Secretary of the Church Missionary Society, the main evangelical society at the end of the 19th century. He spoke at an enormous missionary gathering at Exeter Hall in London in 1888. And there he talks about the great variety of church government. All Christians, despite all that, all Christians could still be seen as belonging to the same outward visible church. Those sectional differences among Protestant Christians, he said, which are purely owing to historical causes or to local causes, will disappear among converts gathered in bodies so divided, if the converts act for themselves in countries where those historical or local causes are inoperative. So in other words, let people decide on how they're going to come to union in relation to their own local context. So he even has a vision of there being the possibility of parallel forms of episcopacy within one church. You might have a Presbyterian model and a Congregationalist model alongside an Episcopal model, all united in a single church with districts with different forms of church government. For him, he used the work of the great Bishop J.B. Lightfoot, one of the leading bishops of the late 19th century, who had claimed that episcopacy was very much not of the essence of the church and had been one of the greatest figures in New Testament and early church interpretation at the end of the 19th century. So the kind of interpretation of episcopacy that found its way into Lambeth 88 and Lambeth 1920 are very much not shared by a significant number of both evangelicals and broad churchmen like Bishop Westcott himself. Now, all of that means that there can be different ways of perceiving episcopacy within the Anglican Communion, at least when one looks historically. It's an aberration in many ways to adopt the form of episcopacy that was adopted in ecumenical Anglicanism after 1920. So let me just draw a few conclusions out of these brief historical examples. Fenn's view, the Church Missionary Society's view, was obviously quite distinct from the view maintained by the bishops gathered at the Lambeth Conference in 1888, and even more so in 1920. It was also quite distinct from what was eventually adopted in the Church of South India, where episcopacy would eventually pervade the whole of the church. And what Fenn's missionary example reveals is that Lambeth Anglicanism, or the establishment of a kind of denomination founded solely on a particular theology of bishops, that's the Anglicanism of ecumenism, is only one variety among the diversity of historical forms of Anglicanism. Anglicanism is not something one can talk about in the singular. However, it's come to be treated with a reverence and a finality, which mean that alternatives maintained by such key figures historically as J.B. Lightfoot, have hardly ever been brought to the ecumenical table. But there's another problem that I'll finish with about the historic episcopate. The adoption of the gift or the sign of the historic episcopate in 1920 as the kind of mechanism for ecumenism, that can also be read as a mechanism for the continuation of the cultural hegemony of the Anglo-American world. The vision for the end of denominations did not amount to the triumph of contextualization or indeed the euthanasia of the mission. Indeed, it's possible that the idea of episcopacy, which came to dominate the discussions around the Church of South India through the 1930s, it was in part a mechanism for ensuring that the church remained firmly in the hands of a particular type of white man. The vast majority of bishops shared a similar educational and political outlook. They were English and American men. They were formed with a particular set of virtues, and they sought to use those virtues to educate churches across the world, to educate churches as well as races and nations in the art of self-government, but always on their own terms. As the great historian E.H. Carr once put it, international order and international solidarity will always be slogans of those who feel strong enough to impose them on others. That's another way of looking at the historic episcopate. Here on my last slide there, I've put Bishop Oluwole. He was the only black bishop at the 1920 Lambeth Conference. It was bishops from across the Anglican world that contained one Nigerian and one Indian. I don't have a photograph of him at the Lambeth Conference, but Bishop Azariah of Dornocal was also at the Lambeth Conference. It was 2 bishops in among the 300 or so attending. So I'm not quite sure how this story of Anglican identity and the historic episcopate and the kind of post-colonial critique of the historic episcopate fits into the Porvoo story. But I think something about the language of sign and something about the language of gift says something as well about how that which is signified might be perceived. What do bishops look like? The Anglo-American Church of the Lambeth Conference of 1920, defined through its bishops, may not be completely unrelated to the kind of Anglo-Nordic, Baltic, Northern European Porvoo communion establishing itself on another new world order following the collapse of the Berlin Wall. What kind of bishops do we have? What kind of values do they represent? How do they want to share those values with others? It's a thought about how episcopacy and the teaching of episcopacy is related to international politics, and indeed how ecumenism itself is related to the worldviews of the time. Porvoo comes at a very distinctive time in the history of Europe. So does Lambeth 1920. I'm going to finish there on that provocative note and see whether anybody has any ideas about how Porvoo might be linked to this understanding of a kind of white Anglo-American Nordic episcopate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. You asked the question, and I'm going to answer it for you. How does all this fit in? I'll tell you how it fits in. As I listened to you, you opened a wonderful box of exotica around this terminology and the vital energies behind it, and the very sort of knick-knack things that make up, which then comes out as this ready-made sausage at the other end, and it's and it's wonderful to see the meat as it goes in. what makes up the rather abstract and general principles and declarations and all the rest of it. And I was just simply delighted listening to you. And I certainly personally appreciate this, because what you did for this one term or for Anglicanism, we could and we should all do for each of the partnerships in the POVO world, in each of our countries and in each of our separate religious contexts. So thank you very much, and I hope there are many questions to you as we listen to this. So the floor is open. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much for that fascinating description. And I wanted to bring it to the present time, and wondering how, with the different types of bishops we have in the United Kingdom, who will ordain women, will not ordain women, and the groups that follow them, how does this affect the tenor of ecumenical relationships? Or VU, any ecumenical relationships? Because you've got a tremendous division there.
It's hard to see bishops as a sign of unity in a church where not all bishops are in communion with all their clergy, it's a highly complex situation. I mean, and other churches across the Anglican Communion and none other have set up the same kind of model of having formal oversight in that way. Formally it is delegated, extended oversight, so they do try, at least in legal theory, to ensure. But the sign of unity is very hard when you've kind of legislated for disunity. So it does mean a lot of the rhetoric around episcopacy and the sign language, all this kind of sacramental language that's used about it, it all becomes a bit of a nonsense when you're a sign of unity for a small group within a church. In the last, I've been on General Synod of the Church of England for my sins, and have just come off for my salvation. The last 5 years.
It's called purgatory.
Purgatory, yes, I've been in that. But in the last 5 years, there was even the appointment of a bishop who would look after conservative evangelicals. We now have a bishop who so it's almost pick your bishop. So what we've done is, within the Church of England, we've managed to contain the kind of dissent that led to the separation of the different bits of Anglicanism within America, for instance. And that's partly the nature of establishment, is that it becomes extremely difficult for people to gain employment outside the established church. So we have a very different way. It's nowhere near as congregational in terms of finance as it is in other churches, in other countries, other societies. So we've managed to kind of legislate for a kind of division by having this semblance of unity, which is, we're all supposed to teach about the 5 guiding principles. That means we're all supposed to respect one another. And ordinands, when they're ordained, are supposed to sign up on this. But in practice, it makes Anglicans, it makes Church of England people. I shouldn't use the term Anglicans, because most Anglicans don't have that kind of model at all. Church of England people can look extraordinarily complicated when they go into the ecumenical table. So the latest round of ARCIC was really scuppered, because it meant they spent all their time asking Anglicans to work out what on earth it was that Anglicanism was about, and trying getting a Church of England people to find a coherent kind of model of what their church was extraordinarily difficult once you created this kind of institutionalized division.
There's nothing like, Mark, there's nothing like coming to an ecumenical meeting to discover what the tenets of your own denomination are all about.
Yeah, well, that's, as I say, in 1920, that's how Anglicans kind of invented their identity, was through but it was particular people at particular times for particular reasons came up with a model of Anglicanism that most Anglicans wouldn't have accepted, that then becomes the kind of official Anglican.
But you could say exactly the same thing for Lutherans in Latvia when they would argue with the Paulo thing. Valdi.
Yes, thank you. I have a question about Meissen. You said that it's still going on circles. There are any new developments, discussions, or it's stopped where it was?
I think we're at the stage now of reinvigorating the desire for full visible unity, whatever that means. But it probably means something like the ability to share in the interchangeability of ministries. So, the kind of Porvo style of what one might be moving towards. It doesn't necessarily mean one won't be beset with the same kind of problems we've been talking about today, but it does mean that there'll be at least an interchangeability of ministries. I'm trying to think creatively around that as to how to think pragmatically about how that could be acceptable particularly to the, I guess it's the significant number of Church of England people who maintain the absolute essential nature of the episcopate. And if one looks at the recent Church of England Methodist relations, which they've come to a proposal that would have led to some form of full interchangeability of ministries, that was scuppered on almost exactly the same grounds as the Church of South India. There was this idea of an interim period where people would be ministering without episcopal ordination. The interesting thing is that the opposition didn't come just from extreme Anglo-Catholics. In many ways, some of them were quite supportive because they knew they would not have to deal with any of these Methodists. It came from liberal Anglo-Catholic bishops, and it just was not accepted by the House of Bishops. So there was no way it would become law. So they've had to paper over cover over the sort of the failure of that. We're at the stage of almost going back to the beginning with the Methodists. As we all decline together, it means that one isn't sort of engaging with unity for the sake of mission. And that's the thing that's got rather lost from the table. And I think we're just trying to find some creative ways forward, both in the Meissen Commission and the Theological Conference, which is what I've been heading up recently, to try and think through whether there are more creative ways at looking at oversight, which wouldn't threaten the kind of identity that rests upon this this idea of an historic episcopate as being the great guarantee of all authority. So how can you have a notion of apostolicity that is maintained through the church that isn't dependent simply on the sign of a particular person wearing a mitre or whatever?
Mark, do the Anglicans like you? I mean, do they let you go free beyond the chain? I think.
Do the Anglicans? I mean, I don't know. I get they haven't sacked me yet. I mean, in some ways, we're trying to think creatively, and obviously, the rhetoric that one uses when one's an official. This is, as far as I know, this is not an official meeting, but so I can be more free in what I say. But in terms of, obviously, in the Meissen process itself, one is having to remind people from both sides about what the goals that have been accepted are. And that's one of the interesting things about it. Often one loses sight of what the churches have already declared. So the Meissen Declaration itself went quite a long way towards the acceptance of churches as churches, full visible churches. It's just that there wasn't the interchangeability of ministry. So it's a reminder of that, and also a reminder that the desire for full visible unity has been accepted. So not to lose sight of that. In recent years, really from 2000 to very recently, the kind of the move forward was very much just sort of learning from one another, looking at one another, but not in a creative way to move on. So I think that's what we've been trying to do.
As we come to the end of our conference, Pastor Jojan, I will let you ask you a question in a second, but I wanted to make an observation that as I listened to these wonderful presentations, and they really were wonderful because they all included something that was vital to what we're all about. I constantly heard myself asking two major questions. One is whether all of this stuff, discussion about the Porvoo, discussion about the historic episcopate, discussion about ecumenism and so on, whether there isn't a cultural train that has gone way past us, and all of the discussion is being held in a station where there are no longer trains, and no trains will ever come in, and that in fact the whole issue has gone elsewhere. That's one question. The other is, does anybody care? But the other question is that it seems to me that the church, as we discuss these things, I hear this split. It's the same thing in all of the presentations of let's say, the Anglican situation, of the low church, high church, of liberal, conservative, of evangelicals and high Anglicanism, of reformists and traditionalists, congregationalists and Episcopalians, functional and principal ideas, and so on. It seems to me that there's something in the world culturally that's really going on, and the church is just simply mouthing cultural truths on two sides, and we have nothing that we really represent for ourselves. We're not really very authentic. All we're doing is taking sides in a different cultural world, and thinking that we're talking about the church, or talking about Christianity, or talking about the gospel, or talking about anything that's important in following Jesus Christ. And that really is a question in Latvia, it's a question in Estonia, it's a question in Anglicanism. And I wonder for you, Mark, and for all the other presentations, whether you ever have the same feeling that I do, that the dog is elsewhere and we're just a tail that is being wagged.
I think, yes, I mean, I think probably we all have that, in a sense. You know, what's the point of all this? How are we engaging with a fairly futile thing whilst the whole world is changing beyond all recognition? Who are we representing? What are the churches representing? Are we just prisoners of a particular kind of understanding of our culture at a particular time? All of those questions, I think, come back over and over again. And anybody who's a church historian like I am, I think, is asking those kind of questions. I mean, one of the reasons for trying to locate the doctrine of historic episcopate is that if one does the historical work, you realize just how closely connected it is with particular visions of the world from an Anglo-American perspective at a particular time. And maybe we're living in another time where things are creating sort of a sense of identity that we need to wrestle with in our own ecumenical work or in our own theological work. So I think we're all asking those questions, and I guess one can despair or be cynical, or one can draw as much hope out of the process as is possible. And I'm still in that position of seeing at least a modicum of hope for the future, probably.
I wonder if Rico or Jaakko or Laima, or if you, as we're summing up and coming to the end of our day, whether you have any comments in the same sort of anxiety, if I could call it that, or questioning that Mark just described for his own experience.
Maybe Jaakko.
Jaakko.
Yeah. Could I ask Mark, and probably all of us, what shall we do with the question of threefold ministry? Because we we do have different understandings in our churches. What do we mean by deacons and priest pastors and bishops? And this is clearly dividing us. I wonder if, Mark, you could comment on that.
Well, it's kind of dividing us, but it's also, we had the agreement despite those divisions, despite those different understandings. So it does mean that there is a degree of unity and diversity that we've subscribed to. So in my view, we can carry on with different understandings and we can learn, does it really matter? I mean, it's kind of rather an accident that the Church of England retained deacons as a distinctive order. But you know, we've managed to sort of have an ecumenical agreement despite that, despite having the different understandings. And I would see that as a cause for rejoicing and not worrying too much about trying to find agreement and consensus about that. But others probably like to have all things neat and tidy.
I'm very happy to hear that, because the training for deacons in a Lutheran context is totally different. They are not theologians. They are not ministers.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have any, I mean, there's been talk about distinctive diaconate and all that stuff, but effectively it doesn't really exist in the Church of England, despite, with very, very rare exceptions.
Yeah.
There is no difference in training at all. You know, deacons are apprentice priests. That's effectively how it works. The Americans call them transitional deacons. And that is probably how we've understood things. So I think it's a cause for rejoicing, really. You know, I think it's a way of learning about what diaconal ministry might be about as well. In terms of the priestly ministry, there's also diaconal. All of that's quite a good way of informing it, but it's not really a cause for anxiety, at least on my part.
I'm happy to have, if I may add one small aspect here. In our tradition, deacons do not have any liturgical duties. So there's a major difference there.
Thank you. Laima.
Yeah, thank you. I just try to answer your question, Juris, by saying the last question, what I did not mention in my presentation. Do we believe ourselves to be truly part of God's one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church? If yes, what we can do to fulfill this idea in our practices? And as I see the context and the trend in different churches and different countries, the key word, what we must reflect on and maybe deconstruct and reconstruct is unity. What does it mean to be united? We see in Latvia now that we are a totally divided nation into vaccinated and not vaccinated people. And we cannot bring these two parts together because we do not put so many effort on our thinking, how to use our language to for uniting things, how to be united. And from my researches, I find out that dialogue, it's only the way to talk with each other in a horizontal level, well, where both sides want to talk with each other and respect each other. And I think that in this ecumenical movement, we made some kind of dialectical cycle. And this is the one step in our maturity, how to become this united church. This is my simple reflections. What?
I always thought, Laima, that the point of the gospel was that it gave us the reason for unity, and possibly, hopefully, in the future, the reality of unity. Now it seems as the other way around, that we don't even believe in unity, and we neither believe in unity nor do we have the tools for. I mean the theological and fiducial tools for striving for unity. I mean, that's perhaps too pessimistic, but my feeling is that, like all of you, I've been participant in numerous ecumenical discussions, and it just seems that the wheel is wheeling around, and it doesn't have any direction.
Juris, if you compare your experience 50 years ago and nowadays, is it worse or a little bit better with this?
Well, I don't think it's worse or better. I think it's in a greater disarray. I don't think it's worse or better. I think it's sort of more purposeless. I know. I mean, that's my contribution. You don't have to. Nobody has to respond to that. But does somebody else want to say a few words at the conclusion? We have maybe 2 or 3 minutes left, and I certainly would invite anyone who wants to put in a wonderful word for the faith of unity and the work of unity and the hope of unity as we conclude our discussion of. By the way, I've always thought that the POVO agreement represents the way that things should be done without all this finery, where Christians say, "I will call you a Christian, and I expect you to call me a Christian," and we go ahead. Yeah, Pastor Jojan.
My hope for ecumenism would be that if we use the metaphor of the trains again, and trains are usually late,
if they arrived at all.
If they arrive at all, well, they will always arrive somewhere because they can't jump off the track. And the track has 2 irons. It's the official bit and it's the grassroots bit. And if those are not in balance, ecumenism, I think that would be the salvation of ecumenism. If we have more of a balance between the grassroots movements and the official, theoretical, theological part of ecumenism. That's my little speech.
Sure. And you already brought that up when you talked about the contextual impetus and what we call adiaphora and what we don't call adiaphora. Thank you. Riho, you have a moment since the Latvians have been talking a lot, maybe the Estonians.
Thank you. No, just to stress that I think also that the unity is a value, even if we have to redefine what is the unity, or to make a compromise in some places where we can see that we don't follow the agreements exactly, but still we have this agreement, and we could try to adjust a bit of our behavior and our views towards the unity. So it's better to have bad peace than good war in a way. And this issue of bishops, understanding of a bishop, it's certainly to some extent contextual, cultural, connected to the understanding how people are led, or how the leading structure in the society should be. But I think that here also some different understanding or redefining using those cultural circumstances, which are also mentioned in the agreement, can help somehow.
Riho, that's wonderful. You raised this great flag, and I think we all are happier for it, that you made us see it again, that there is something there called unity that we all hope for, strive for, and live for. And thanks for pointing that out at the end of our conference. I want to thank all of you again for, especially of course, for the presentations, those of you who made the effort to be a part of our day in that way, and but also for all the others who are here to listen and to share and to ask questions. Tom, I wasn't sure, where are you coming from? Where are you sitting?
In Arlington, Virginia, just across the river from Washington.
That sounds like another continent.
It is.
I used to live in Maryland for a while, so that's not that far from Arlington. We would go to Arlington because there was low tax rate for goods to be bought. Anyway, again, appreciate your being here, rising early, 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock to be part of our conference. And once more to all of us, on behalf of the University of Latvia and our Faculty of Theology, what a delight, and our deep gratitude to all of you. Have a good day.